Would you like to see the God of the Bible exactly how the ancient worshippers did? We explore the origins and evolution of this divine figure central to ancient Israel. Our exploration delves into the roots of the ancient biblical deity, often referred to as Yahweh, tracing the lineage back to the earlier deity El. Through historical and archaeological insights, we bring to life the physical body of God that ancient worshippers understood. This documentary also sheds light on lesser-known topics, including the powerful figure of Asherah, traditionally seen as the companion or consort in this ancient pantheon. Join us as we unveil the secrets and mysteries of these ancient deities, set against the rich tapestry of the ancient Near Eastern world. The real God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is often misunderstood. Those who cherish this God have manipulated the actual reality of the texts. He appears most frequently, the Bible. And yes, I said he, because God is described vividly as being a masculine warrior, just like the rest of the known ancient Near Eastern gods. We will unravel the mystery of who the real God of the Bible is by showing you exactly what he looked like. Notice I'm using looked like in the past tense. This is because the ongoing interpretations of the text describing this God have buried his physical existence in a black hole of philosophy. They have buried God into a metaphysical grave by ignoring the obvious texts which describe him. I want to be upfront and say this documentary is inspired by Professor Francesca Stavrakopoulou's absolute goldmine book, God and Anatomy. This book is one of the greatest reads I have ever come across pertaining to bringing God back to life in his original setting, the ancient Near East. For those who don't know, Francesca Stavrakopoulou is a British biblical scholar and broadcaster. She's currently professor of Hebrew Bible and ancient religion at the University of Exeter. Her frustration with people completely ignoring these ancient texts for their theological limitations is also my frustration. I want to know the truth, meaning what does the evidence actually say? Can we come to actually see the God of the Bible for what he would have looked like if we situate him in his historical cultural context? I share the desire to see this God I once devoted my everything to in his actual context. For most of my early life, I believed in the supernatural, where God resides, and that this God was actively controlling this world and its fate. The closest I would come to seeing God was in my imagination, mind, or dreams. I would often equate this God with Jesus and could put a face to God through the New Testament image of Christ. As I started studying the Bible without my theological baggage, I discovered a whole new amazing world around the Bible. Here's an analogy. Imagine being at a David Blaine magic show with thousands in attendance. A person wearing a hoodie in the back corner away from the rest of the crowd whispers, "Hey you, Would you like to know exactly how he does his tricks? Imagine I respond, what do you mean by trick? David has actual powers. He actually has the ability to do the things we are witnessing. This person insists that David is performing an illusion and doesn't actually have powers. They say, I can show you how man-made this whole show really is if you're interested. My response is a bit bewildered because I believed that David had the actual powers to perform real magic. I answer, sure, I'm interested in seeing how he does it. In my mind, I'm extremely skeptical that this is just an illusion. And I'm also really afraid of my deepest convictions of the magical world being just an illusion shattered. Part of me wants to really know, and the other part is just afraid. I follow him behind the curtain, and he shows me the wizard with its excellent ability to create an illusion, which gives a mass placebo to the auditorium. I now know it's a trick. But does that take away my excitement? Does this ruin the fun? For me, it made me ask this person, show me more. My desire to understand at a far, far deeper level has been unlocked. From this point onward, I hang out in the David Blaine shows with my dark hoodie, whispering to the crowd, do you really want to know how he does it? Understanding the Bible, which also entails the God central to it, is a bit like this magic show. Francesca Stavrakopoulou gets it. She sees behind the curtain of theological trickery and shows you God as he really is, or really was. She describes how as an undergraduate in college, she found the feminist scholars took aim at the maleness of God in scripture and how they would just remove God's body from the equation to solve these gender issues. She recounts her engaging in a Q&A with a Christian professor who insisted on the corporeal context of God's body to be metaphorical or poetic. She soberly expresses herself.
Everyone else in the room seemed remarkably content with this approach to the God of the Bible, but I found it deeply frustrating. Why should I look past the clear image of God as a gigantic man with a heavy tread, weapons in his hands, and breath as hot as sulfur? A God who took on a monstrous sea dragon in a physical fight and won. A God who walked about in his heavenly garden and in the cemeteries of his people. A God who stripped a woman naked and offered her up to be gang mutilated. A God who sat on a throne in a temple, enjoying the aroma of scorched animal fat as he waited for his dinner. A God who not only had children, but who willingly and willfully offered up his beloved son to be killed as a sacrifice. How could I not be distracted? Here was a deity just like those I'd visited in museums as a child. A God of ancient myths, fantastic stories and long-lost rituals. A God from the distant past. From a society utterly unlike our own. Those were the terms on which I wanted to encounter him, not as a distant and abstract being, but as the product of a particular culture, at a particular time, made in the image of the people who lived then. A God shaped by their own physical circumstances, their own view of the world, and their own imaginations.
The God which is expressed in her book, God and Anatomy, and of course this documentary,
is the deity as his ancient worshippers saw him, a supersized, muscle-bound, good-looking God with superhuman powers, earthly passions, and a penchant for the fantastic and the monstrous.
Following Dr. Stavrakopoulou's book, I will highlight the strong takeaways from her work in this documentary. However, you must understand that her book is so unbelievably fantastic. You would be committing an unforgivable sin not purchasing a copy. It goes into several sources we won't be able to cover in this video. I will also follow her chapter titles for each section as she performs an examination of God's body and will attempt to follow along with the flow of her book. She doesn't shy away from looking at every part of this male deity, shocking to most. She even reveals God's family jewels, which played a significant part in producing godly offspring. Doesn't this imply God might have a wife or partner? Maybe she will watch this and appreciate MythVision's dedication to stay true to her research and to credit her for her brilliant masterpiece. Thank you, Francesca. Here's to you, my friend. Dissecting the Divine. Spanning back in time, even before written history, humans have made gods into their own images. We all know the famous biblical cliche, "We are all made in the image of God." However, experts in the study of mind and cultures have known for a long time the way people think and the biases they have play a big role in how they imagine and create the idea of gods or a higher power in their societies. More than 2,500 years ago, during the late 500s or 400s BCE, a Greek thinker and explorer named Xenophanes of Colophon already figured this out.
If cattle and horses or lions had hands or were able to draw with their hands and do the works that men can do, horses would draw the forms of the gods like horses and cattle like cattle, and they would make their bodies such as they each had themselves.
Xenophanes saw the problem that each culture had a god in their own image. He saw that these gods from all over acted very much like humans, which he saw as an issue for the divine. Looking at how Homer and Hesiod paint the gods as having committed acts unbefitting for the gods by stealing, committing adultery, and tricking each other. His philosophy led him to denounce gods being human-like by their actions, thoughts, or nature. He was also one of the earlier Greek poets and philosophers who can be credited in nudging things toward monotheism. Later, Greek minds like Plato, 429 to 347 BCE, and Aristotle, 384 to 322 BCE, and schools of thought carrying this torch, taught that the ultimate power that supports and creates everything in the universe doesn't have a physical form. It's an invisible, unseen force or mind that's completely different from the world we can touch and see. Most common folk still held the idea of the gods having bodies like us. These philosophical ideas would eventually have Jewish and Christian thinkers separate their idea of God from the material world, with God dwelling in the spiritual, heavenly realm, completely divorced from the earthly, human one. Thanks to Plato's influence for influencing Western constructions of God, these philosophical notions are not compatible with the Bible. God is clearly expressed in anthropomorphic terms, which simply means God has attributes or qualities very human-like, because this is exactly how these ancient authors understood their God.
Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground."
Have you ever noticed the plural description of God creating man and woman? This is clearly the divine entourage with God who participate in creating mankind. But most don't pay attention to the description of making man in God's image. At least most theologically minded believers. That is because man was made to look like the gods. Yes, that's right. According to Genesis, Adam and Eve were made to look just like God, visually, which made humans superior to all other creatures. You might be shocked or skeptical, but a few chapters later, we get a closer description of what is implied by being made in the image of someone.
When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth.
Elsewhere, we see that divine statues are the visual likeness of the gods they represent. Genesis 1 creation was potentially written in the 5th century, drawing on older myths portraying a god named Yahweh who just ruled Jerusalem, but today is seen as the universal God. When this was written, Yahweh was chief deity among many gods similar to the Babylonian Marduk or Zeus from the Greek world. He was still centuries away from being seen as without a body. As Francesca says in the book,
Instead, he was just like any other deity in the ancient world. He had a head, hair, and a face, eyes, ears, a nose, and a mouth. He had arms, hands, legs, and feet, and a chest and a back. He was equipped with a heart, a tongue, teeth, and genitals. He was a god who breathed in and out. This was a deity who not only looked like a human, albeit on a far more impressive, glamorous scale, but who very often behaved like a human. He enjoyed evening strolls and hearty meals. He listened to music, wrote books, and made lists. He was a god who not only spoke, but whistled, laughed, shouted, wept, and talked to himself. He was a god who fell in love and into fights, a god who squabbled with his worshippers and grappled with his enemies, a god who made friends, raised children, took wives, and had sex,
She expresses that this isn't something on some old clay tablets of mythologies about gods. This is the clear language of the Bible. This Bible is made of several books with various genres, with the first parts of the Bible being the Hebrew original called Tanakh by Judaism and Old Testament by Christians. The Tanakh was written between the 8th and 2nd centuries BCE in Judah. Judah was the areas we call today Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and western Syria. Judah was conquered by Assyria in the 8th century BCE, again by Babylon in the 6th century BCE, and was part of the Persian Empire in the 5th century BCE. Then they were brought into Alexandria when Alexander the Great brought the empire around 333 BCE. The biblical texts express these changes from political empire to the next, while giving fun stories of very ancient mythical and legendary heroes. It contains oracles claimed to come from various prophets, as well as poetry, ritual songs, prayers, and teachings. Absolutely none of these texts have made it down to us in their original form, with scribes recreating, making additions, revisions, all to reflect the interest of later generations. It's safe to say that the Torah and the remainder of the primary history portray God's special relationship with Israelites. These authors crafted a past for their heritage, giving them a unique identity. Much of the writings that discuss historical events should be taken with a grain of salt. While there is real events described in some of the material, non-biblical material has shown us the Bible's portrayal of past events should not be taken as reliable recorded history. Don't believe me? Well, take the 9th century BCE Northern Kingdom of Israel ruler named Omri. In the biblical texts, he is demoted and insignificant, with only a mention of founding Samaria. A stone monument set up by Mesha, the king of Moab, a place near ancient Israel, celebrates taking back large areas of land from Omri, king of Israel, and his follower, who had ruled over Moab for a long time. Records from Assyria, a powerful empire during the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, often refer to the kingdom of Israel as Omri land and its kings as sons of Omri, showing that Omri's influence lasted a long time. However, the writer of the books of Kings in the Bible downplayed or even hid how important Omri was. This is hinted at by a brief mention of the rest of the acts of Omri and the power that he showed. It's obvious the biblical authors had Jerusalem as their central focus, with the only legitimate worship of Yahweh. Problem was, there were several Yahweh temples in town, and these authors portrayed Judah's kings who closed them down as righteous. Archaeology has revealed an 8th century BCE southern Judah Yahweh fortress, another in the 5th century Egyptian island of Elephantine, as well as a 5th to 2nd century BCE Mount Gerizim site. Point being, the worship of Yahweh was not as centralized as these elite authors pinned it to be in the Bible. The Hebrew Bible is so driven by ideology that it is often unreliable, living with the trauma of the Babylonian troubles leading into the Persian Empire, potentially starting the literary works we see today. During the Second Temple period, scribes and priests were successful and reworked old texts, creating new ones through the perception of exile, return, and restoration. Of course, the texts exaggerate that all Judahites experienced restoration, but reality shows only the elites and some of the higher classes had even been deported to Babylonia, and the majority remained there in Judah. Many Judahites migrated to various locations like Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Levant during these heated political times. Eventually, Greece takes over from Persia, where most Jewish peoples read in Aramaic and Greek. This led the reading of their sacred scriptures in these languages. Among them were the Jewish Jesus movement, which took on a life of its own over a few generations, with all their literature, gospels, epistles written in Greek and their text overshadow the Hebrew scriptures as time goes by. Okay, back to God's body. There isn't a single place anywhere in the Bible denying God's body. In fact, it is only affirmed. Some mortals were lucky enough to see it. After leaving Egypt, a group of Israelite leaders went up to Mount Sinai and saw what they believed were God's feet, and then God himself. Moses was among them, and he's said to have had a regular friendly chat with God, as if talking to a friend. But Moses wasn't the only one who reportedly encountered God in person. In the Bible's Genesis, Abraham walks with God, and Jacob wrestles with him. The prophets Isaiah and Ezekiel, in the books named after them, both describe seeing God on his throne, while Amos sees him standing in a temple. In the New Testament, Jesus claims he has seen God and is even described as sitting next to God in heaven. One may point to Adam walking with God in the cool of the day, or Stephen from the book of Acts. Also, John in Revelation on the island of Patmos. During the Second Temple period, circa 515 BCE to 70 CE, when the temple was destroyed, people understood God to hide his body from the world not visible to most humans. Just because a body can't be seen doesn't mean it doesn't exist. The Ten Commandments hint at a suggestion to the idea of making images of God was a normal practice by those worshiping Yahweh.
You shall not make for yourself a carved image, whether in the likeness of what is in the heavens above, or what is on the earth below, or what is in the waters beneath the earth.
The Israelites were no different than their next-door neighbors. People believed that while gods usually stayed hidden in their heavenly homes, they could choose to show themselves on earth as statues and places of worship. These statues weren't just symbols. People believed that statues were the actual God, not just a representation of them. People today think this is stupid. However, that's misrepresenting these ancient minds. They perceived reality not just to the physical, but from natural to supranatural. They saw these realms to be passable in both directions. These gods could technically be in more than one place in their world. Francesca mentions how ancient Mesopotamian ritual experts comment on the gods.
The divine statue was born in heaven and made on earth.
Technically, these gods weren't limited to one location. They could be invisible in the heavens, at the same time showing up as stars, statues in places of worship, figurines at home, or even natural or even invisible forces on earth. But I can hear the apologists say, the ban on images is evidence that God didn't have a body and shouldn't be portrayed in idols, making this God different. You are wrong, my friends. Several cults from Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and the Phoenicians practice what's called aniconism. Aniconism is when religions or cultures don't create images or figures to represent things from the natural world, the supernatural, or certain beings. You can find this in Buddhism as well as Islam. Shoot, it even shows up in certain places in Hinduism. And while these earlier cults practiced imageless worship, they were understood to have bodies. Prohibiting divine images in the Ten Commandments points towards God's hiddenness of his body, not that he didn't have one. This idea is a step in the direction of the abstract, incorporeal deity of the post-biblical religions of Judaism and Christianity. The Bible describes God as having a human-like form, a personal name, a history, a family, and even a group of heavenly beings that accompany him. Curriculum Vitae, God's CV. God's real name is Yahoo, or even Yah. It's really impossible to know at this point. The ancient Hebrew language, like modern Hebrew and Arabic, only used consonants in writing. So in old writings, God's name appears as, and you see this on the screen, and we're not sure how it was pronounced. The longer version, what looks like Yahweh, is the one most often found in the Bible's ancient Hebrew texts. Add to this difficulty, the name eventually becomes unutterable, though some Greek and Roman scholars pronounced it as Yahweh or Yahweh, which became the known way of saying Yahweh. Yahweh was among many gods in the late Bronze Age to early Iron Age, 1500 BCE to 550 BCE. This polytheistic world portrayed the gods as having families and social structure, mirroring their human worshippers. El was seen as head of pantheon of gods among most societies in the Levant. He was considered the main god in charge of the universe, with other lesser gods beneath him. Each of these lesser gods was responsible for different parts of the universe and life, like storms, the ocean, sunlight, stars, fertility, birth, war, and death. The collection of gods in Ugarit, a region in the Levant, was typically for the religions there around 1000 to 2000 BC, which is when the early worship of Yahweh started. This group of gods was formed based on the very human idea that being a god without any connections to others meant missing out on the advantages of working together, having a status, and having family ties. In other words, a god without these social connections was seen as powerless and, frankly, of no use to humans. To be quite frank, the Bible expresses this God wasn't alone. A piece of old pottery in the book of Deuteronomy in the Bible places Yahweh among a group of gods and even tells us who his father was. It talks about how humans were split into different groups or nations, and each group was given a specific god to look after it. But the god in charge of this arrangement wasn't Yahweh, it was Elyon, a name for El that shows his status as the Most High God in the group.
When Elyon Most High apportioned the nations, when he divided humankind, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the divine sons, for Yahweh's portion was his people, Jacob, Israel, his allotted share.
Yep, you heard that right. Yahweh had a dad and divine siblings. But it doesn't end there. The Bible reveals other things about Yahweh's earlier career, which is shocking to some. Some of these mythical elements of Yahweh's past run contrary to the demythologizing efforts of some of the later scribes. Rather than supreme king of the world, Yahweh gets depicted as a badass fierce storm god on the outskirts of the occupied world in ancient places called Sur, Peren, and Temen. This area is depicted as a risky and mountainous wasteland. It seems to be situated south of the Negev desert, past the Dead Sea, in a region that was once known as Edom and is now part of southern Jordan. Yahweh, one of the ancient gods, might have been similar to a wild and rowdy bunch of gods known as the Shaddai or Shaddai gods. These gods were associated with the wilderness and were not the top dogs. That honor went to a god named El. An exciting discovery in Deir Allah, a place in the eastern Jordan Valley, gave us a peek into the world of these wild gods. Here, a building wrecked by an earthquake around 800 BCE held a secret. Archaeologists found broken pieces of a long message that once decorated a wall. When they put the pieces together, they told a story about a guy named Balaam ben Beor, who could see into the future and even shows up in a story in the Bible. The message said that a bunch of gods came to Balaam with a warning. The Shaddai or Shaddai gods were plotting against their boss, El. They planned to cover the sky in thick clouds, leaving the world in darkness. The gods told Balaam, "This will happen and nothing will survive. What you've heard is unlike anything anyone has seen." They left Balaam pretty shaken up. These heavenly rebellions are common in ancient West Asian myths, but showing that El is the chief deity over Shaddai gods finds parallel to the title given El, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as El Shaddai. People have wrongly assumed the name means God Almighty, but it actually means something like God of the wilderness. Academics have known for a long time now that El, not Yahweh, was the original God of Israel from the Bible. His name is not only in the patriarchs, but is also the name of Israel, meaning Israel. Yahweh would eventually kick Daddy off the throne, and become the top dog. How this happened exactly isn't clear. We know that El's role in the tradition remained, and it becomes clear later scribes tried rationalizing Yahweh's takeover by suggesting, well, he was actually El all along.
I am Yahweh, the deity says to Moses in Exodus. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name, Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them.
While Yahweh's origins seem shrouded in mystery, by the 9th century, he was the head honcho of both Israel and Palestine, Judah, with Jerusalem, its capital. Yahweh was considered their national god, with a number of other gods worshipped as well. One of the more favored ones was Yahweh's wife Asherah, the goddess. There is no doubt about this, as we have inscriptions from the 8th century BCE from worshippers desiring blessings from Yahweh and his Asherah. In fact, the origins of her name hint at her previous identity. Asherah in Hebrew is derived from Atharat, a title used in the ancient city of Ugarit for the divine matriarch and El's companion. It appears that in assuming the mantle of his legendary predecessor El, Yahweh also contained his spouse, which would be his mom. Later scribes go on the warpath to trash the goddess by demoting her outside of heaven forever. The fall of the Queen of Heaven seems to show a shift away from state-sponsored polytheism set off by the Assyrian destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel and the Babylonians' wrath against Judah. Yahweh, the warrior deity, failed to protect his people, forcing the elite scribes to rationalize Yahweh's absence due to the sins of human devotees. This all may come as a shock for many hearing this for the first time, but the theological baggage people bring to the text of the Bible seriously stops them from seeing these texts as well as the outside archaeological and historical evidence for what it really is. Remember, the texts of the Bible were never intended to be valid accounts of the actual past. These texts do not even agree with themselves on several issues, portraying competing ideologies at times. Dr. Stavrakopoulou says it well.
Despite the theological changes wrought by the emergence of ancient Judaism and early Christianity, the one aspect of this deity that remained unchanged was his corporeality. By virtue of having a body, he endured as a powerful social agent in the lives of his worshippers across the centuries of the Bible's formation. In exploring the body of this ancient deity, as his worshippers imagined him, we can access their world. We can meet the real God of the Bible.
Grounded. Dr. Francesca Stavrakopoulou visited a temple in northern Syria around 2010 at Ain Dara, which was remarkable. She describes it as a gateway to heaven, with massive mighty lions with teeth and claws revealed guarding the entrance. This temple is the abode of a forgotten god, which was honored by the Syro-Hittites, who were remarkably similar to the ancient Israelites and Judahites. It looks close to the description of Solomon's temple from the Bible. She describes being barefoot approaching this sacred space and witnessing the massive footprints of this deity. Her book is worth the purchase just for her breathtaking description of her experience here. It becomes clear, while this god has been long forgotten, their bodily presence was not forgotten, evident by those enormous footprints entering its eternal residence inside, with no exiting tracks anywhere. The picture of this landscape helps bring to life what the ancients understood when they thought of the divine. These gods must be present in some tangible form. These footprints of the god express what it means to be human as well as divine. The footprint has lasting impressions in culture as much then as it does today. We take imprints of our newborn baby's feet or have footprints of celebrities in California's Hollywood Boulevard. The footprints of Australopithecus afarensis, some of our earliest bipedal hominid ancestors captured in volcanic ash over 3 million years ago in Laetoli, northern Tanzania. These prints are more than mere image, but bring to life the presence of the whole body. All around the world, people have been fascinated by stories of gods and magical creatures leaving their footprints on Earth, from ancient rock art in Scandinavia and Britain to the sacred island of the Incas in Lake Titicaca. These footprints footprints are found in many places and hold great significance for different cultures. For instance, in southern Botswana, a giant hunter named Matsing is said to have left his mark near a waterhole. These footprints are not only interesting, but also important in the rituals and traditions of various communities across history. Some of the oldest stories come from the lands around the Mediterranean Sea. The Greek writer Herodotus told of huge footprints left by the hero Heracles, while in Egypt, the goddess Isis supposedly left her footprints all over the place, along with her partner Serapis. One of the most famous footprints is on a mountain in Sri Lanka, where people from different religions see it differently. Hindus see it as a footprint of Shiva, Buddhists as Buddhas, Muslims as Adams, and Christians as St. Thomas's. Even in Jerusalem, there's a rock with a footprint that is claimed by both Muslims and Christians. Muslims believe it belongs to Muhammad, while Christians think it's Jesus's. Whether these footprints are natural, made up, or part of ritual ancient practices, they show how people across the world have always felt a connection between the divine and our earth. The feet of the gods are extremely important. This goes for the biblical portrayal of God as well. Francesca expresses this to be the case for Adam and Eve, hearing Yahweh's steps coming closer in the garden. When Moses first lays eyes on his God, he sees God standing on a magical rock in the wilderness.
Then Moses went up with Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and they saw the God of Israel, and under his feet there appeared to be a pavement of sapphire, as clear as the sky itself. Yet he did not reach out with his hand against the nobles of the sons of Israel, and they saw God, and they ate and drank.
Once the story moves to Jerusalem, God makes sure you know where his feet are at. It's all over the place in the Bible.
The glory of Lebanon shall come to you, the cypress, the plane, and the pine, to both be the place of my sanctuary, and I will make the place of my feet glorious.
God's feet smash the bodies of his enemies. They make the earth rumble with each step into the desert. His feet cause mountains to split. Humans have lost touch with the ground and our feet through evolution, thanks to the invention of boots, chairs, pavements, and motorized vehicles, which have separated us from the earth. The ancients were far more grounded. Their gods were also very grounded. Their presence was often depicted by standing stones across the Levant. While the exact function of these standing stones is not certain, from around 3100 to 2000 BCE, during the early Bronze Age, by the Middle Bronze Age, standing stones were identified with extraordinary beings, like gods, ancestors who were deified, and other supernatural powers. This continued all the way into the Iron Age. Check out this image of standing stones from ancient Gezer in the foothills of the ancient Judean mountains. In ancient times, standing stones were a common sight in places of worship dedicated to Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. These stones could be found both within city temples and in outdoor holy areas. Archaeologists have unearthed evidence of these stones showing that they were an important part of religious practice. Some of these stones have been around for a very long time. For example, near the modern city of Nablus in the West Bank, there used to be a large religious site in the early Iron Age city of Shechem. This site had 3 big stones that had been there for hundreds of years. Although now broken, the biggest of these stones is thought to have been almost 10 feet tall. Other standing stones were added more recently. There was a temple dedicated to Yahweh inside a fortress in Arad, located in the Negev desert, dating back to the 8th century BCE. This temple had a standing stone about 3 feet tall, which was once colored and it had red paint. Around the same time, up in the northern part of the neighboring kingdom of Israel, the city of Dan had a sanctuary with several groups of these standing stones. These stones were often found with incense burners and animal bones nearby. The standing stone played a significant role even into the 3rd century CE. Look at this coin from Byblos on the left in the image and Tyre on the right. Standing stones, which held significant cultural and religious importance, are depicted on ancient coins from Byblos and Tyre, 2 historic cities. The coin from Byblos features an image of a standing stone located within a temple area that has pillars. On the other hand, the coin from Tyre showcases 2 standing stones stones placed on a raised platform. These stones are depicted alongside a sacred tree and an incense burner. Below the stones, the words ambrosial rocks are inscribed, highlighting their revered status. Dr. Stavrakopoulou expresses that standing stones were common and held great importance in ancient times across the Levant, an area that includes parts of the modern Middle East. These stones and the places they were set up had special names in the Hebrew Bible. A standing stone was called a masabah, which comes from a word that means standing, and the places where these stones were located were known as makom, which means a place where something stands. The Bible tells a special story about a place called Bethel, which is now near Ramallah in the West Bank. This place was very old and important, and its name, Bethel, means house of God, or more exactly, house of El, hinting that it was first a temple dedicated to a God who came before Yahweh. Over time, followers of Yahweh made this place their own and created a story in Genesis about its beginnings. The story goes that Jacob, an important figure in the Bible, was traveling through Canaan looking for a wife. One night, he used a stone as a pillow and had a dream. He saw a stairway, not a ladder, with angels going up and down, showing that this was a place where humans could connect with the divine. Suddenly, Yahweh appeared next to him, introduced himself as the God of Jacob's ancestors, and promised blessings of children and land in return for their loyalty. When Jacob woke up, he realized he had been sleeping at a sacred place. Excited, he declared,
"Yahweh is in this standing place, and how awesome is this standing place."
He set up his stone pillow as a masabah, poured sacred oil on it, and promised to give offerings to Yahweh there. Later, Yahweh even told Jacob,
"I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed the masabah."
This story shows how the ancient people saw these standing stones not just as markers, but as points of connection with the divine, where they believed gods could stand and be present. Underfoot. In ancient times, only special groups like religious leaders and the rich could write. So people often used things like seals and amulets as personal symbols. Rich people had special seals to stamp on wet clay to show something was theirs, like a jar of wine. But everyone, rich or poor, also used personal items like clothes or even body parts to show who they were. We've even discovered late Bronze Age clay tablets from Mesopotamia that show kids' footprints as items of identity and exchange. In one case, a family sold their daughter and one-year-old twin boys because they were starving and couldn't afford to feed them. The person was a religious guru called Baal Malik, who purchased them for 60 shekels and trained the boys to become diviners. The clay tablets that document the sale are visibly showing the children's feet as receipts and as signs of their new identity as children of a new family. The foot also was used in legal rituals of selling land. One owner lifts their foot off the land, and the new buyer sets their foot on the land as a symbol of ownership. The Bible shows similar customs where people claimed land by walking on it or transferred it by giving a sandal to the buyer. In some cultures, when a man died, his relative could claim his land and even the right to marry his widow by using a ritual involving sandals, showing their right to take over his property. The Bible is full of these body rituals. God promises the Israelites,
"Every place you set your foot will be yours. Your border will extend from the desert to Lebanon and from the river, that is the Euphrates, as far as the Mediterranean Sea."
God tells Abraham to walk through Canaan entirely, and he will give it to him. Shoot, even Satan plays a role. This is before he has taken on the evil connotations.
The Lord said to Satan, "From where have you come?" Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and fro on the earth and from walking up and down on it."
In these texts, the author is engaging in powerful political rhetoric. This idea of lands being taken by conquest, with kings setting his foot or bringing down his sandals on conquered peoples and their land. We literally see this with King Tutankhamun's ceremonial sandals, depicting bodies of foreign enemies upon whom he stepped. Just like this pharaoh, Yahweh uses his sandals in destruction of his enemies.
Moab is my wash basin. On Edom I toss my sandal. Over Philistia I shout in triumph.
These gods and kings back then were not joking with their sandals. One of the most visibly obvious scenes of the foot and its power is seen with the victory stela of a formidable Mesopotamian king, Naram Sin, circa 2254 to 2218 BCE. He was the grandson of the first emperor in the world, Sargon of Akkad. Now displayed in the Louvre Museum, a stone monument from around 2250 BCE tells a story from ancient Iraq. It shows King Naram Sin's victory over the Lullaby people from the Zagros Mountains. In the carving, Naram Sin looks powerful, climbing a mountain towards the gods while stepping over his defeated enemies. He's depicted much larger than his soldiers and foes, showing his godlike status. Naram Sin was one of the first kings to claim he was a god, and this image shows him wearing a god's crown, symbolizing his control over the world, just like a deity. In many ancient religions from Southwest Asia, the idea of gods fighting chaos was common. People believed the world was created after a young god fought a sea monster, often described as having 7 heads. These myths, while different in details, had the same outline. A brave god fought this monster using magic weapons. After a fierce battle, the god won, stepping over the monster's body to show victory. In some stories, the god would then cut up the monster to form the sky and the ground, dividing the heavens, earth, and underworld. By defeating chaos, the god became king of the other gods and got his own temple. The most famous story like this is the Babylonian Enuma Elish, written over 3,000 years ago. In this epic, the god Marduk beats Tiamat, the mother of gods and the symbol of the sea. The story highlights the power of Marduk's feat as he conquers chaos.
He flung down her carcass, he took his stand upon it. The Lord trampled upon the frame of Tiamat. With his merciless mace, he crushed her skull. He cut open the arteries of her blood. He split her in two, like a fish for drying. Half of her he set up and made as a cover, heaven. He stretched out the hide and assigned watchmen and ordered them not to let her waters escape.
As Dr. Stavrakopoulou says so well pertaining to the biblical portrayal of Yahweh,
in the Bible, the battle is fought between Yahweh and the aqueous chaos monster, whose various names attest to its dangerously disordered, unbounded nature. Leviathan, Twisty One, Rahab, Overflow, Yam, Sea, Nahar, River Flood, Tannin, Dragon or Sea Monster, and Tehom, Deep, many of which are the same names given to Baal's watery arch-enemy in the older Ugaritic myths of the battle with disorder. In several biblical texts, Yahweh is praised for driving back Yam, breaking the heads of the sea monsters, piercing Rahab, smashing the heads of Leviathan, dismembering and cutting openings in the corpse of chaos for springs and torrents.
The book of Job describes a huge sea creature that's really fascinating and a bit scary. Imagine a giant water monster with skin like a wall of interlocking armor plates. This creature is so fierce that it can shoot flames from its mouth, and when it sneezes, it looks like lightning. Its breath is so hot, it's like a fiery smoke coming from its nose. When it moves around in the water, it's so powerful that it makes the sea boil, creating foam that looks like white hair. Even the other powerful beings that hang out with the god Yahweh are afraid of this monster. Yahweh himself points out that this creature is so intimidating that none of the gods would dare to mess with it. He asks,
who could ever stand up to it and come out unharmed?
The only one capable of controlling this chaotic beast, it turns out, is Yahweh. He's so strong, he can catch the creature like a fish, cut it up, and stomp it under his feet. Yahweh is depicted elsewhere in the Bible as subduing the monster's watery body beneath his throne.
The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord is enthroned as king forever.
Yahweh is a royal king in his temple, ruling over the chaos monster and its waters, forced to sing a praise to Yahweh's power.
Yahweh is king. He is robed in majesty. Yahweh is robed, he is girded with strength, he has established the world, it shall never be moved. Your throne is established from of old, you are from everlasting. The river floods have lifted up, O Yahweh. The river floods have lifted up their voice, the river floods lift up their roaring, more majestic than the thunders of mighty waters, more majestic than the waves of the sea. Majestic on high is Yahweh.
This defeat of the chaos waters is found all over the Bible. In Exodus, Yahweh cuts the waters to allow Moses and the Israelites to pass. Jesus walks like a god on stormy seas. Michael the angel fights the seven-headed dragon in the final apocalypse. We also see this with the Greek myth of Bellerophon defeating Chimera. These gods and their feet need to be in high places. This is why the temples were located on hills. Think of Mount Olympus, Mount Sinai, or Horeb, Carmel, Tabor, Ebal, Gerizim, Zion, or Mount of Olives. Here is an example from Amos 4:13.
For look, the one who forms the mountains, creates the wind, reveals his plan to mortals, makes the morning darkness, and treads on the heights of the earth. Yahweh, God of hosts, is his name.
The gods, including Yahweh, were giant. Many gods had massive furniture in their temples, and in the case of Yahweh, the Ark of the Covenant enthroned upon the cherubim where he rests his feet. Footloose. Dr. Francesca Stavrakopoulou will take us through all of God's body parts, with this section being the final foot section. Men and their gods have fought since before written history. If we look at the Ark of Titus, you can see the Romans taking the holy relics and spoils from the Jerusalem temple on stone reliefs. This symbolizes the defeat of your enemies and their gods in combat. The way they depict sacking the temple is with much disrespect compared to other examples. The way the powerful emperors of Southeast Asia triumphed was just a vicious but more respectful to the other sacred or divine booty. Compare both images. The second one is an Assyrian palace relief from Kalhu, Nimrud, dated to about 730 BCE, showing Levantine gods being conveyed out of their conquered city by victorious Assyrian troops. Notice the feet of the deities on the shoulders of these soldiers are elevated, keeping their divine authority intact. The kings could meet defeat and fall prostrate by removing their footstools, but the divine was usually always exalted, even from your enemies' deities. The biblical God is seen in various texts as a king ruling on a throne, seated where those in attendance are always standing. This was courtroom etiquette for both the gods and humans. Here's a perfect example said well from Francesca's work.
A telling example of gods behaving badly is found in the Mesopotamian myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal, the earliest known version of which is dated to the 15th or 14th centuries BCE. When the goddess Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld, sends her official representative up to the heavenly realm to attend a banquet on her behalf, she is enraged to learn that one of the gods, the ambitious, cocky Nergal, refused to rise to his feet in the presence of her vizier. "Bring him to me, that I may kill him," Ereshkigal commands. In a series of unsettling twists, Nergal descends to the underworld with an army, intending to behead the goddess and seize her throne. But as they grapple in the throne room, Nergal fiercely clutching feasnals of the queen's hair, she suddenly offers to become his wife and to share with him her underworld kingdom. He relaxes his grip and she weeps. He cries and they kiss. He wipes away her tears, accepts her offer, and is enthroned alongside her. As challenging as this myth is to the gender-alert sensibilities of modern-day readers, it underscores the ancient conviction that a deity's enthroned status was to be preserved at all costs.
This is no different from the biblical portrayal. Francesca brings up that fantastic mythological scene of the somewhat divine enemy named Daystar, son of Dawn, ascending the divine mountain Saphon, attempting to dethrone Elyon, the Most High, saying,
"I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit on the mount of the divine assembly on the heights of Saphon. I will ascend to the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like Elyon."
Time to send this guy to the underworld, the place of the dead. Christianity also reused this myth in the fallen angel Lucifer, that guy from Isaiah wasn't fit for the throne of El. In fact, no one was bodily fit for the throne of the king of the gods. At Ugarit, Baal's throne was so big, they weren't sure if they could find a successor for him. When they thought they found one, who was named Athar, he sits in Baal's seat, and the other gods scream.
His feet do not reach its footstool. His head does not reach its top.
The feet must be securely fixed to the royal footstool, not hanging above. The oldest god known in the cosmos, named Anu from Mesopotamia and the Hittites, was dragged by his feet for trying to escape a challenge by his son, Kumarbi. Anu tried flying to the top of heaven and was caught by his heels, dragging him down, and Kumarbi bit off his genitals. Gods need to keep their foothold in the divine world. The Greek myth where Zeus takes the throne from his father Kronos is very similar. Remember, Kronos castrated his father Ornos. Zeus had to face Typhon, who cut his tendons on Zeus's feet and hides them. Later, he finds his tendons for his body and officially secures the throne. The back of foot as a weakness is seen in Achilles during the Trojan War. The heel carries power in a real sense to the ancients. Look at the biblical version with Jacob. His name means hill taker or supplanter. As his twin brother Esau exited their mother's womb, Jacob was said to hold his brother's heel, signaling that he would reign over his brother, taking his birthright. Yahweh's Ark of the Covenant was his footstool, where he sat on the cherubim. This is worth remembering when we look at the story in Samuel where Philistines fought and defeated Israel, then took their ark with Yahweh back to their temple of Dagon to show respect to Dagon. Turns out the morning after, the Philistines return and Dagon has fallen face first before Yahweh's ark. They set Dagon back up, and the next day, not only did Dagon fall again, but he was destroyed. His head and hands cut off, sitting on the threshold. The authors portray that Yahweh and the ark were one and the same in a very real way. We even see later scribes try demythologizing this detail. However, when synagogues start showing up in history, we see the Torah texts enshrined in an ark. In fact, we see that many Jews started making the synagogue where God's feet are firmly planted after the temple's demise in 70. Archaeology has found an interesting shrine at a synagogue in Migdal on the coast of the Sea of Galilee, seemingly drawing some of the temple images from Jerusalem. This looks like the footstool of God at this synagogue. I want you to look at this video for a second. I traveled to Israel and we went to Migdal with Dr. James D. Tabor and Gnostic Informant. We filmed and I caught some footage here at that synagogue. There's also some Jewish bath pools where you can go and ritually cleanse yourself as part of their religious practice. And so I hope you enjoy this clip. The footstool is so remarkably important in various ways. The gods needed to rest their feet on the footstools to maintain stability, keeping everything in order. Dr. Stavrakopoulou shows a fascinating example of this from ancient Ugarit.
When the late Bronze Age goddess Atharat pays a visit to her husband El, he is so delighted to see her that he unfurrowed his brow and laughed. He set his feet on the footstool and wiggled his toes. His footstool is pressed into performative service again when he learns that Baal is dead, having been swallowed into the underworld by Mot, the god of death. El is distraught. He descends from his throne and sits on his footstool, and then lowers himself from his footstool to sit upon the ground to mourn. Baal is dead. What has become of the powerful one? He cries. After Baal, I shall go down into the underworld. Coming down from his throne onto his footstool marks his ritual descent from the heavenly realm into the earthly world, the place of his feet, while his lowering from his footstool onto the ground enacts his descent from the earthly realm into the underworld. With the heavenly gods El and Baal out of place, the universe is catastrophically turned upside down. As Anat exclaims to Shapsh, the sun goddess, "Dried up are the furrows of the fields. O Shapsh, dried up are the furrows of El's fields." Baal is neglecting the furrows of the ploughland. Where is mighty Baal? Where is the prince, master of the earth? Cosmic order is only restored when El foresees the return of Baal and his reigns, and reseats himself on the throne, pointedly seeing his feet on his footstool once again. "At last I can sit and rest," El declares, "for alive is mighty Baal."
When Jerusalem was destroyed by Babylon, many Yahweh worshippers thought he had been dethroned and his feet had fallen off or been taken off his footstool. However, others rationalized that Yahweh, in his gigantic stature, traveled away on the wings of the creatures he rested upon, called cherubim. This is not an absurd notion, since gods utilized creatures for transportation often. Ishtar and Atheret stood on the back of a lion, Adam and Baal a bull. Others stationed themselves on a lion's body snake-like dragon, such as Marduk and Asherah. They could travel the heavens and cities situated upon their pedestals, as seen in Psalms 18, 9-13.
He parted the heavens and came down. Dark clouds were under his feet. He mounted the cherubim and flew. He soared on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him. The dark rain, clouds of the sky. Out of the brightness of his presence, clouds advanced, with hailstones and bolts of lightning. The Lord thundered from heaven. The voice of the Most High resounded.
Yahweh may have left his temple, but he wasn't removed from his throne, cried his worshippers. Even Yahweh himself said as much, according to the late author of Isaiah 66, who is downplaying the destruction of the temple.
This is what the Lord says. Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Where is the house you will build for me? Where will my resting place be?
Well, if God is seated in the heavens, and the earth is his footstool, then temple or not, his enthronement hasn't changed. But this is also telling us of his gigantic stature. Francesca says it so well.
In the Greco-Roman world, a certain philosophical distaste for the earthiness of the material world, combined with an increasing spiritual preference for the abstract and the transcendent, had been percolating among the intelligentsia for some time, encouraging a re-evaluation of the nature of the divine. It was against this backdrop that the architects of early Christian doctrine sought to understand their own scriptures, in which God was oven, presented in disturbingly corporeal terms.
Some of these earliest Christians loved making all of the body parts of God metaphorical and allegorical, not to be taken literally. The level at which they would go to get around these clear corporeal passages is absurd. When God was walking in the garden, Christians would say this was actually the sound of Christ as the pre-existent spoken word of God moving towards them. That's just desperate. They really did lose touch with the context of the ancient texts. Briefly, feet also can be used as erotic suggestions of the penis. We see this in the book of Ruth, with Ruth being told to seduce Boaz by putting on perfume, uncovering his feet while he sleeps, and position herself there. Ruth does just that, and guess what? She gets pregnant. Several examples can be shown in Dr. Stavrakopoulou's work. Genitals. If you really want to make people uncomfortable, start talking about sex and our body parts in great detail. If this is bad, it gets worse when we start talking about God having a penis and sexual functions. Remember, we have seen thus far that God has a body. He has feet. And it's extremely important, if we're going to see any other body parts of God, that we need to peel back that magic trick curtain put up by the distaste for sexual behavior with influence by Stoic and Platonic philosophy. We have to cut the anachronisms of interpretation out and see the texts for what they really say. Put down our theology and put the biblical texts in their original ancient context. We've seen what happens when we do this with God's feet. God not only has feet, but his feet function similar to other cultures and their understanding of deity. When we do this, we can unashamedly say the God of the Bible has a penis, children, and a sexual track record. We might change the known saying from being hung like a horse to hung like God, thanks to the reactions by Counter-Reformation sensitivities. Michelangelo's famous nude Jesus was condemned as something belonging in a brothel. Take a look at the nude Jesus statue. Now take a look at the version with the silly bronze loincloth fixed to it. The unchanging reality of God and Christ played a significant role in the decisions of steering away from genitals being displayed visibly from Jesus or God for that matter. Francesca says it really well.
These values and meanings are closely linked to the generative and changeable physiology of our genitals. After all, they are places of potent physical transformation. Pubic hair grows, grays and fades as we age. Vaginas open, expand and contract during sex and in labor, and are the entry and exit points at which new life is brought into the world. Penises alternate from small and V to large and hard as erections come and go. Scrotums, labia and clitorises similarly enlarge and engorge and shrink and retreat at the stimulus of touch and temperature. Genital skin is recurrently moistened and scented by the body's natural lubricants and the wetness of sexual arousal, or by menstruation, ejaculation, and the expulsion of urine. Our genitals are subject to changes in appearance, touch, smell, function, and form more than any other part of our bodies. They are powerfully transformative, and like other manifestations of power and transformation, they are potentially dangerous unless carefully harnessed or managed by the social and cultural preferences of the communities in which we live.
The idea that sex and genitalia are sinful was influenced heavily by Paul and Augustine, the Reformed womanizer. They interpreted the fall of Genesis with Eve as the temptress, making innocent nudity despicable nakedness. The fall was understood sexually, and only through the virgin Jesus and his virgin mother was to be found the last Adam. Dr. Stavrakopoulou suggests the fall in Genesis had nothing to do with the sin of sexuality. Adam and Eve disobeyed God, and now, sharing godly wisdom, the humans have become like one of us, made like the gods. Their basic clothing is seen as their rising to heightened status, which God affirms by crafting leather outfits from their basic fig leaves. Just like the gods, Francesca says it best.
Humans immediately harness their newfound wisdom to do as the gods have always done. They bear children, cultivate crops, and rear animals. They kill, travel, play music, build cities, forge tools, craft weapons, and perform rituals. In covering their genitals, Adam and Eve reveal not their sexualized self-corruption, but their godlike capacity for the creation of culture.
Thanks to the ongoing philosophical asceticism growing among Christians, they corrupt all original context of interpretations to these ancient texts. It's safe to say that Jesus himself is painted as teaching much of these ideas in the Gospels as well. In ancient Southwest Asia, many terms in literature refer to genitals in forms of colloquialism or slangs, euphemisms or idioms, allusions, and wordplay. Take it from Dr. Stavrakopoulou as she describes this linguistic and cultural understanding.
Common linguistic strategies to describe the sex organs included concrete terms for tools and weapons for male genitals: bow, arrow, staff, rod, plow, and domestic or horticultural language for female genitals: water well, churn, field, garden, fruit. Other body parts frequently served as stand-ins for the genitals, particularly hand, thigh, limb, or flesh for the penis, lips and mouth for the vulva, and feet for the genitals of any type of body. Abstractions, too, were especially common for male sex organs. Nakedness, strength, and virility are frequently acested. These linguistic tics are arguably a reflex of common cultural anxieties surrounding the sexual organs, a reflex similarly pervading modern societies. Both British and North American English, for example, enjoy a rich spread of genital vocabulary, from the formal penis, testicles, vulva, vagina, and the politely veiled private bit, John Thomas, Lady Garden, to the childish willy, winky, foo-foo, vajayjay, and the vulgar that I can't say on YouTube.
This makes perfect sense because we still do this today in modern society. The Song of Songs describing sexual desires and union eventually get turned into religious passion. The later scribes clearly wanted penises tightly secured under the tunics and not leaky. Women menstruating were seen as worse, but also needed to go through purification processes during their period. One of the more controversial ideas for most coming across Dr. Stavrakopoulou's work is her description of Ezekiel's description of God and his vision. Ezekiel is very detailed in his description of everything he sees and doesn't see, she says.
As Ezekiel describes God, he knows exactly where to look and what to say, or rather, where to look and what not to say. His gaze sweeps up and down God's body, but he no longer describes precisely what he sees. Instead, he veils the deity in the religious language of glorious, mysterious spectacle. Upward from what looked to be his motnayim, I saw it sparkling like amber. It seemed to be enveloped all around by fire, and from his motnayim downward, I saw something like fire, and brilliance surrounded him, like the bow in a cloud on a rainy day. This was the appearance of the brilliance all around. This enigmatic language is a uncanny priestly distancing device designed to reverently conceal the divine body from the eyes of the uninitiated. But Ezekiel leaves exposed one body part, God's motnayim, a Hebrew term traditionally and politely rendered loins or waist, but which more accurately refers to the groin and its genitals. Ezekiel might shy away from describing God's face, his torso, his arms, legs, and feet, but he openly acknowledges God's genitals, navigating his visual journey up and down the divine body by means of the godly groin. It is not only a stunning display of the graphic corporeality of God, but a theological manifestation of the distance and difference between mortals and God. If in Genesis human bodies are made culturally visible by the covering of their genitals, in Ezekiel, God's body is mysteriously, transcendently concealed by the exposure of his.
She describes that Isaiah saw God's genitals as well, describing how God's dangly bits, or private parts, filled the temple. Even the seraphim with their 6 wings made sure to cover their genitals in the presence of Yahweh. The text says they covered their feet, but it is suggested their genitals are euphemistically described as feet. God has really big genitals, according to Isaiah, and just like temple priests are to keep their genitals in check, so did the seraphim. Don't believe us? Well, Yahweh's daddy El was well endowed as well.
In the mythological stories enshrined on the clay tablets of cosmopolitan Ugarit, c. 1250–1200 BCE, El's penis makes several appearances. In one myth, the god sets out along the serpentine seashore at the edge of the world, where he encounters 2 young goddesses. They urge him to get an erection and take them in body and marriage. The response is unambiguous. El's penis grew as long as the sea. El's penis grew as long as the ocean. Having installed them as brides in his home, he grasps his penis in his right hand and shoots it skyward like an arrow to ence his new wives into consummating the marriage. They are suitably impressed with his masturbatory performance. El stoops to kiss them, relishing the pomegranate's sweet taste of their lips, a delicately sensuous double entendre. Penetrative sex quickly follows, and El impregnates the goddesses, who bear him the gracious gods Shahar, dawn, and Shalem, dusk.
Holy smokes, these stories get wild. I noticed the further back in time, these myths are highly sexual in nature. El is seen in the BOWEL cycle offering his primary wife Athirat sensual or sexual satisfaction. He says,
"Does the penis of El the king excite you? Does the love organ of the bull arouse you?"
El, using the picture of a bull, is well known to carry masculine tendencies. In ancient Sumerian myth, Enki, born from a divine bull, fathered by a wild bull, fertilizes the world by creating irrigation ditches with his penis and making the Mesopotamian rivers by his semen.
After Father Enki had lifted his eyes across the Euphrates, he stood up full of lust like a rampant bull, lifted his penis, ejaculated, and filled the Euphrates with flowing water. By living his penis, he brought a bridal gift. The tigress rejoiced in its heart like a great wild bull when it was born.
Dr. Stavrakopoulou also describes this is what the Egyptians did as well. Take a look at the god Min with his fertile erected pecker. Shoot, I've even recorded several courses as well with Dr. Karakuni, who's an Egyptologist, and she echoes this mythology and its sexuality. In fact, it's honestly difficult to discuss these ancient myths and not come across the sexual imagery in the deities' activities. If one is going to investigate these ancient myths, they must get over our modern sensibilities. Here is an image of Zeus hiding his identity as a bull after sexually abducting Europa. Now that's one cool image. Francesca knows all too well how people can point the finger to other myths and their sexual bull gods, so she makes sure to mention Yahweh as well.
Among these high-status deities, it is no surprise to find that Yahweh too was often understood as the divine bull. Bovine language, the Hebrew term Abir, underlies his biblical designation as the mighty one, Abir of Jacob, who grants genital fertility to the Israelite tribe of Joseph, and in some biblical text, Yahweh's cult statue is said to take the form of a bull or a bull calf.
You might say, I don't see any sources for these claims. So Dr. Stavrakopoulou made sure to back this up. Take a look at all the sources on the screen right now. All of these sources you can go and check for yourself and help back you up claims. By the way, in case you're wondering, get her book, because her book endlessly sources in the footnotes where you can go and see all of this for yourself, investigate deeper. She compares Yahweh to Enki, showing he is a fertile creator god in the highest order, taking Israel and his wife, using the euphemism to know, where he impregnates her.
I will take you for my wife in faithfulness, and you will know Yahweh. On that day I will fructify, says Yahweh. I will fructify the heavens, and they will fructify the earth, and the earth will fructify the grain, the wine, and the oil, and they will fructify Jezreel, and I will seed her for myself in the land.
Phallic masculinities. Dr. Stavrakopoulou is hilarious in this book by showing the public manly locker room talk between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. I'm not talking about the famous meme, grab her by the locker room talk by Trump, but a nuclear-sized penis showdown between two national leaders at the time. Kim Jong-un says,
"Nuclear button is on my desk at all times."
So Trump says,
"Will someone from his depleted and food-starved regime please inform him that I too have a nuclear button?" He continued, "But it is a much bigger and more powerful one than his, and my button works."
This is a power of the penis showdown with warfare implications. This hasn't changed with humans, though this is exactly how the ancient gods acted as well. The bow was often a phallic symbol and was the weapon for the ancient Babylonian god Marduk from the Enuma Elish. When he completely destroyed Tiamat, he uses his bow called the Deluge and shoots his great weapon at her, penetrating her throat with her mouth wide open, impelling her heart. The ancient Babylonian scribes would mention how Marduk destroyed Tiamat with his penis, or penis bow, which was forever suspended in the sky as a rainbow. Can anyone say, Noah's flood? Yahweh is known as a man of war and as a war god. He is seen with weapons of thunderbolts, lightning strikes, and rains, which are compared to his mighty bow and speedy arrows. Francesca says it this way.
Like Marduk's bow deluge, Yahweh's bow is identified with his erect penis, albeit in the euphemistic language of bare flesh. You brandish your bow of nakedness, you satisfy the shafts of your bowstring, enthuses the prophet Habakkuk in his gloriously graphic vision of Yahweh as the ultimate phallic warrior. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, this is the God who is said to crush the genitals of his enemies so that they cannot rise up against him. His weapon is so intimidating that when he approaches, his enemies' own bows slacken and droop, their penises sink, and their genitals tremble. More horrifying is the sexualized nature of Yahweh's punishing assault on his own people.
Another fun fact. This is a world where it is condemned for a wife to take the top position during intercourse, going back from Mesopotamian sources down into the Babylonian Talmud, with painting the ancient Mesopotamian baby murderer as Adam's first wife called Lilith. It's also worth noting that these people believed that the man's semen is what formed the child. Men usually beget children, and women, well, they simply bared them. The word of producing a child by the man with his penis is synonymous with his hand. By the work of his yad, hand or penis. His labors in everyday work were also seen in his requirement to reproduce.
Yahweh your God will make you abundantly prosperous in all the work of your hand, penis, in the fruit of your woman's womb, in the fruit of your cattle, and in the fruit of your soil.
But when a woman wasn't getting pregnant by her husband, she would be seen as barren, which makes those divine birth narratives in the Hebrew Bible come to life in a whole new way. If men were ever considered to experience inability to produce a child, it was likely demons, evil magic, or spirits of angry young virgins. Damn. Looks like women in ancient society were blamed one way or another in this context. The weird thing about their idea about sperm is that male gods could technically create things like the universe by masturbating it into existence with their own semen. Egyptian high god Atum lets loose in his own mouth and spews out a seed to create a male and female deity. This is established fact, and every Egyptologist worth their salt will tell you this.
I am the one who acted as husband with my fist. I copulated with my hand. I let fall into my own mouth. I sneezed shoe and spat tefnut.
These wild stories also show up in a story from Mesopotamia, where Enki is coercive with female deities, including his own daughters, and ends up ingesting his own semen due to the clever machinations of Ninhursag by planting his semen in the earth and causing Enki to eat the plants that were produced. Let's just say Enki impregnates himself, getting morning sickness and all, and reproduces more gods from himself. Freaking wild stuff. Look at what Professor Stavrakopoulou shares about another myth.
Anatolian traditions of the late 2nd millennium BCE, detailing the escapades of the rebellious Kumarbi, last seen pulling down the high god Anu from the heights of heaven and biting off his genitals. Having swallowed the god's penis and testicles, Kumarbi realizes 3 offspring are inside him. Like Egyptian Atum, he spits out 2 new deities, but the third remains within his body, rapidly growing into a formidable rival. Kumarbi understandably worries about how to birth him. It is an anxiety shared by his unborn son, the terrifying warrior god Tahun, who is repulsed at the thought of emerging into the world via his father's rectum. It is only by smashing open his head against the cliffs of Mount Tassa that Kumarbi reluctantly enables the new god to break out of his body, a skull birth Zeus similarly experiences in delivering his warring daughter Athena.
Okay. We see the ancients painted it as a danger for a deity to produce without the female body involved. Of course, Dr. Stavrakopoulou goes into much greater detail, some of which cannot be mentioned here due to it being so graphic. However, let's look at a biblical portrayal of God in Genesis. Of course, the biblical authors tried stripping the Bible of its mythical elements as much as possible. Much earlier Mesopotamian myths show a group of gods, both male and female, using clay and blood or semen to create man. The biblical account has Yahweh act alone in making a human named Adam from the dust of the ground, which is called Adama, and breathed into his nostrils life, making the human a living being. Gosh, that sounds close to the earlier ideas of gods putting semen into the earth or ground to create life, even if the explicit language of semen is gone. And did you know that Lady Wisdom was also created by God's breath? This goddess, known as Chachma and Sophia, depending on Hebrew or Greek, was said to accompany God at the creation of the world. Her birth from God gets described in Sirach 24, 2-4.
In the assembly of the Most High, she opens her mouth. In the presence of his hosts, she tells of her glory. I came forth from the mouth of the Most High and covered the earth as a mist. I dwelt in the highest heavens, and my throne was in a pillar of cloud.
Just as the god Atum from Egyptian mythology brought a sacred being into existence that represented the damp air by breathing it out, God also creates a holy figure in a similar way by sending it forth from his mouth. Perfecting the penis. Today we might think this question is silly, but the ancients thought it was serious. Did God create Adam circumcised or not? The answer would tell us as much about God's penis as it would Adam's. I know. You might be saying Abraham was the first guy to snip the old foreskin, but in fact, similar language describing Noah as Tamim, which just means he's worthy to walk with God as a whole or unblemished person. So rabbis had clever ways to solve these problems. How about Adam though? They say he was born from the earth in the image of God. So of course he was circumcised. This notion has ancient roots, as Francesca expresses.
God's direct forerunner, the late Bronze Age deity El, appears to have undergone circumcision in a ritual preparing him for marriage and sex with the 2 goddesses he encountered at the seashore. In this Ugaritic myth, El seats enthroned, equipped with phallic symbols of old age and infertility. In his hand, the staff of sterility. In his hand, the staff of widowhood. El's reversal of the lifelessness, held in his hands, is revealed in a ritual assuring his sexual fecundity. His foreskin appears to be removed, and the wound wrapped by ritual specialists associated with the careful cultivation of sacred vineyards. Those who prune the vine pruned him. Those who bind the vine bound him. They let his tendril fall like a vine, like a budding vine clipped into fruitfulness. So El's circumcised penis brings forth children in his new marriages, infant deities, whose own genitalia, grapes and tendrils, are inspected by a birth goddess to ensure they are in order.
You really gotta love Francesca. She continues, highlighting that strange mention by Eusebius of Caesarea, sourcing Philo of Byblos, about the ancient Phoenician myth where El circumcises him, then sacrifices his only begotten son, Yedod. Yep, God sacrifices his only begotten son in the Bronze Age after snipping off the old skinaroo. This account and the Abraham one have so much in common. At least MythVision and Gnostic Informant are on the right track, vindicated by a brilliant mind like Francesca's. One of the oldest images of circumcision can be found carved into the walls of an old Egyptian burial site at Saqqara, which was the massive cemetery for the city of Memphis. This carving dated back to the time of the 6th dynasty, around 2345 to 2180 BCE. You may ask, why did they circumcise? We can rest assured it wasn't a ritual for hygiene, rather for someone becoming initiated for sacred space. The power of the penis in antiquity was major. This is why God instructs Abraham to do this, to walk with God. This speaks about God's penis as much as it does about the mortals. Circumcision brought life-giving abilities, which adds to the reason God promises Abraham that his seed would be exceedingly fruitful and his seed would be innumerable. You can see why these texts instruct men to only sleep with their own wives, not to do so with their own kin, or men, or spilling seed on the earth. They are to be fruitful by multiplying. This is why they are strict about not entering holy spaces too after sexual activities where leakage can occur. They needed to secure their nuggets, if I can call them that, under their outfits as well. Foreign women are to be avoided as well. These women worshipped other gods, and Yahweh wants all his worshippers to be his children, not another god's children. If you had a problem with your penis, this could exclude you from various sacred activities. Wow, thinking about it, these people were super focused on these areas of the body. You really need to read Francesca's book to see what she says about eunuchs. It should go without explaining that the Jewish Jesus was circumcised. However, we find a cultural shift begin to take place in the Hellenistic period among both Jews and Gentiles. Many Jews tried to reverse their circumcisions. They call that an epispasm, which was a physical surgery of sorts trying to create a foreskin. The Greek culture started rubbing off on the Jewish world. By the New Testament period, Paul the Apostle had to instruct his Gentiles not to worry about circumcising to become children of Abraham or children of God of Israel. They could have spiritual circumcision, which was a brilliant social strategy. I mean, seriously, raise your hand if you're watching this video and as an adult would like to go chop that area up. No thanks. Paul was pretty much saying, stay as you are. This gave both worlds, Greek and Jewish, a way to join the Christ movement without sacrificing too much socially. This issue continued into the early church and wasn't solved by Paul. The foreskin obsession continued for millennia, with Christians claiming to have Jesus's own foreskin, which carried magical powers. Francesca gives a very interesting historical lesson about this in her book. This is downright wild material, but necessary for anyone wanting to peek behind the curtain. Please get her book. Divine Sex. We've talked enough about God's family jewels, but what about his wife? Derek, what wife? God never had a wife. My friends, we need to pay attention to the magic trick being performed in front of our eyes by the long-standing defamation of the wife of God, Queen of Heaven. We have ample amounts of evidence showing El had a wife named Asherah, and we also have ample amounts of evidence for a cover-up by biblical scribes trying to trash her name. This propaganda continues by modern minds as well. Dr. Stavrakopoulou expresses this well in her book.
But in Jerusalem's Israel Museum, her open labia signal that she is little more than a commodified sex object. This figurine may represent Asherah, the sacred prostitute, reads the notice positioned next to her in the display case. It is a shocking and misleading caricature grounded in a centuries-old, biblically derived hostility towards the goddess once venerated as the traditional consort of Yahweh, the God of the Bible.
The propaganda of painting her worshippers as whoring after other gods or making her a symbol of prostitution and orgies is unfounded, being more of a tactic used to get rid of her, whether they liked it or not. She was Yahweh's consort as expressed by God and anatomy.
As a number of biblical writers inadvertently confess, his temple in Jerusalem housed Asherah's cult statue. Her cult object, a stylized sacred tree, was planted or positioned next to his altars, and kings and queens of Israel and Judah sponsored her worship in their royal sanctuaries. These admissions on the part of the biblical writers are striking. They demonstrate that even their own account of the religious past, as distorted with bias as it is, could not completely ignore so important a goddess.
While the Bible authors couldn't leave her out of the picture, we have really good evidence before the Bible where Asherah's fame is noted in late Bronze Age Ugarit around 1550 to 1200 BCE. Her name is Atheret, and she is the wife of El, mothering 70 gods as sons, showing she was very active with the big guy upstairs. As the companion of the god El, she held significant influence, acting as a mediator who resolved conflicts and arguments among the gods. She would speak to El on behalf of the other gods, much like a powerful advocate. But her role went beyond that of just seeing divine affairs. She wasn't just a high-ranking figure in the realm of the gods. She was also known by grand titles like Lady of the Sea and She Who Steps on the Sea Serpent. These names hint that she once had a hand in bringing order to the universe, possibly by controlling or defeating the sea monster, a creature that would later become an adversary for many other gods. Her prominence wasn't limited to the realm of the divine. It extended into human affairs, particularly in Ugarit, an ancient city where she was revered. There, she was celebrated as a divine caregiver who nourished and supported the royal line of Ugarit, acting like a heavenly nurse to the kings, ensuring the continuity and legitimacy of their rule. As a goddess from the most ancient of times, her part in the religious tales of her followers emphasized the power of the male god she was associated with. In the late Bronze Age city of Ugarit, this was the god El. Later on, during the Iron Age, in the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, she was known as Asherah and associated with Yahweh. You know, they even discovered an ivory relief of a goddess right next to Ugarit from the 1200s BCE. With a goddess, scholars say it's Atheret, the pre-biblical Asherah. But you might be asking, Derek, I see El as having a wife, but I need evidence of Yahweh having Asherah as his wife. Well, my friends, you're in luck. Back in the 1960s and 70s, a collection of ancient Hebrew inscriptions were discovered which confirm her role as Yahweh's consort dating from the 8th century BCE. It was located in the West Bank at Khirbet el-Qom. The Khirbet el-Qom, and I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, inscription asks Yahweh and his Asherah to protect their tomb from grave robbers so they have a peaceful existence in the underworld. Around the same time in history, other Hebrew speakers viewed Asherah and his Yahweh in the highest view, asking for their blessings. We found pottery at Kuntilit Adrud from likely travelers requesting blessings from the deities in the region, which included Yahweh and his Asherah. Over time, with the coming demise by Assyria and Babylon, the traditional worship would take a serious hit. Yahweh and his Asherah couldn't keep them protected. Forms of their worship continued, which is why we see condemnation in these biblical texts. But the change was happening by these elite authors. Those elites going back to Jerusalem to rebuild the temple not only rebuilt the temple, they rebuilt the religion entirely. They would reduce the pantheon by reducing and removing Yahweh's wife and demote members of the divine council to minor gods, angels, or elements of the universe. There's an astounding biblical portrayal expressed by Dr. Stavrakopoulou. She says it best.
But a glimpse of the true nature of the divine couple's relationship can be found in an ancient poem in Genesis. It recycles an even older incantation, into a ritual song conveying Yahweh's blessings upon the legendary ancestor Joseph. The incantation invokes a series of deities to bestow sexual masculinity and frinalness upon Joseph's penis, euphemistically described as his taut bow and strong hand. Included in the divine roll call is a goddess bearing the title breasts and womb, a likely epithet of Asherah, given it is used of Atherat, her older incarnation at Ugarit. She is paired in the poem with a deity called Father and Most High, ritual titles of the God of the Bible, inherited from Atherat's husband, El, from the God of your ancestor, who supports you, from Shaddai, who blesses you, the blessings of heaven above, the blessings of deep crouching below, the blessings of breasts and womb, the blessings of your Father, Warrior Most High, the blessings of the everlasting mountains, the blessings of the outlying eternal hills. The coupling of Father, Warrior Most High, and breasts and womb points to the sexualized collaboration of these deities, paralleling the pairing of heaven and deep, the divinized primeval parts of the universe, whose union birthed and built the very cosmos. The poem hints at an ancient pantheon, in which the coupling of the high god and high goddess is set within the frame of an ordered, fertile creation.
In the Bible's first book, Genesis, God seems to dislike the idea of gods and humans having relationships. The story quickly goes from humans being created to them breaking rules like eating forbidden fruit and committing the first murder. The worst sin mentioned is when heavenly beings called sons of God find women irresistible and have children with them. These children are known as Nephilim, giant warriors with both divine and human traits. This mixed heritage is viewed as so problematic that God shortens human lifespans and later sends a devastating flood to reset humanity. A more detailed version of these events is an older text, 1 Enoch. Here, 200 watchers or angels fall for human women, share heavenly secrets, and father the Nephilim. The Nephilim consume all food and turn to eating humans. God, urged by angelic appeals, sends the flood to deal with the chaos. This tale worried early Jewish and Christian communities. For example, the Apostle Paul suggested women cover their heads to avoid attracting angels, and later Christian teachings used the story to highlight the consequences of sin. Yet these stories contrast with other texts where God himself is said to have intimate relations with human women, suggesting the issue is not the act itself, but who is permitted to engage in it. Interestingly, sexual desire wasn't always off limits in biblical times. In the Garden of Eden, it was considered a part of God's plan for humans. In the story of Adam and Eve from the Bible, when Eve has her first child, Cain, she says something very interesting. She says,
I have procreated a man with Yahweh.
This isn't the usual way people talk about having a baby, and in some older texts, it looks like she's saying God is the child's father, not Adam. This part of the story isn't often told that way. Usually people say Eve meant that God helped her have a baby, like a blessing. But the words she uses are very direct and might make you think of how gods and goddesses talk about making babies in other old stories. Eve doesn't seem shy about this. She sounds proud and strong, which is different from how Mary, the mother of Jesus, is described later in the Bible. Eve's words make her sound like she had a big role in creating life, almost like she was a goddess herself. In fact, Eve's name and some titles she's given are like those given to goddesses like Asherah in ancient Ugaritic stories, which makes some people think that maybe in older tales she was imagined as a kind of goddess in a heavenly garden, a fitting partner for a god. The Bible also talks about God being in a close and very special relationship, not with a goddess, but with Israel, which is represented as a woman. This idea of turning a place or a group of people into a female character is common in many old stories and writings. In the Bible, this image is used to show how close and important the relationship between God and his worshippers are. This is where things turn a bit dark for most. Dr. Stavrakopoulou brings up Hosea and Ezekiel, where God is painted in a very archaic fashion. Her words explain the matter best, but are seriously way too graphic for YouTube. I wrote a bunch on this. then erased it for the script, her book is undeniably the best on this topic. Suffice it to say, God forcibly makes Israel his wife and does things that I cannot comment on here to her. Jewish and Christian interpreters always want to downplay the obvious language here and minimize the extremely abusive relationship described between Israel and their God. But it's a perfect example of why this God and his prophets are not worth following morally. We find other gods acting this way, such as Zeus, yet Christian fathers like to act like their God was perfect and moral. They must not be talking about the God of the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures. Welcome to the ancient world, my friends. We should celebrate democratic societies which have removed the shackles of this power dynamic abuse against women. In fact, for those Christians smirking because they want to smugly assume the New Testament doesn't play into these clearly horrific activities as portrayed by Hosea and Ezekiel, they need to heed the words of Francesca.
This is why early Christians could so easily conjure the image of Christ as their heavenly bridegroom. It was deeply embedded in their religious DNA. As early as the mid-1st century CE, Paul was telling Christians in Corinth that they were promised in marriage to one husband as a chaste virgin to Christ. Similarly, in his letter to the Christian community in Rome, Paul cast the intimate relationship between Christ and his church as the fertile bodily union of a husband and wife, an image later extended in the book of Revelation and the epistle to the Ephesians to describe the church as Christ's bride. Both these texts draw on Ezekiel's portrayal of God dressing up his young wife like a goddess statue to describe the sexual allure of Christ's bride, but in Ephesians, the parallels are disturbingly pronounced. Here, Christ not only cleanses and beautifies his bride to render her more desirable and holy, but the stark power imbalance of divine-human marriage is used as a paradigm for mortal marriages, for the husband is the head of the wife, just as Christ is the head of the church. Just as the church is submissive to Christ, so also wives are to be, in everything, to their husbands. These and other early Christian texts would authoritatively endorse the self-portrayal of the church as the bride of Christ for at least the next 1,000 years. This was a marriage supposedly ordained by Jesus himself, who in the New Testament Gospels refers to himself as the bridegroom of his followers. But in other ancient Christian texts, Mary Magdalene appears to play the bridal role of the church itself. In both the Gospel of Mary, 2nd century CE, and the Gospel of Philip, early 3rd century CE, she is cast as the disciple Jesus loves the most. She is his beloved and his consort, with whom he not only shares his most authoritative, esoteric teachings, but his physical affection in the form of kisses, much to the irritation of the other disciples.
Continuing on Mary Magdalene, she says,
but as the scholar April DeConnick shows, growing anxieties about the religious authority of women, coupled with increasing conflicts between churches in the Roman East and West, led to her marginalization. Eventually, in what would come to be more prominent theological traditions, she would be cast as a prostitute. Like Asherah and Eve before her, Mary Magdalene was overwhelmingly disempowered by her deliberate denigration as the embodiment of sexual deviancy.
The same behavior and tactics of the scribes to denigrate Asherah were also used for Mary. Seems the easiest way to defame a female is call her all sorts of nasty names and make that the narrative. Geez, I just looked back at her chapter and I cannot find the words to express the disturbing material in this section, which comes directly from our Bibles. My apologies for not diving into this, but if I did, this would be a sure way to have this video ruined by YouTube. One thing I must show you before we leave this section, and this section is about the private parts, is the image found, which is most likely of Yahweh and his Asherah, where you get a good look at his junk. Thanks to Dr. Dan McClellan for this artistic rendition, which is in his book, Yahweh's Divine Images. And he shows the actual pottery, makes sure that he colors it in better than what the pottery itself, if we had a picture of it, shows. He makes sure he brings it to life for everybody to be able to see, and it's more visible. So I want you to look at this pottery for 1 second. The guy on the left, that's Yahweh, the king. He's got the horn crowned. That's what a god wears, is horns on their head. If you look down at the bottom between his two legs, he's got testes and Long John Silver down there dangling. He's a well-endowed figure that shows up here on this pottery. Next to him is his Asherah, it seems. Either the one seated in the far right or the one next to him. And if you notice, the one next to him, there are nipples, unlike what you see on Yahweh on the far left. That is a female. I do not remember the etchings of the language at the top, but this is stuff that they know, and they're the ones and the academics in the field who say, yes, this is Yahweh and is Asherah. Most likely, this is him. So this is really interesting information. If you're ever curious, well, show me his junk. Well, here it is. Torso, back and beyond. There's a strange story in Exodus where Moses asks God to see his glory in all its splendor. God agrees to show him something, but not everything. And so he places Moses between two rocks. Then, covering his sight with his hand until his back is visible, God removes his hand and boom, God shows his back to Moses. He shows his back, supposedly, because no man can see the face of God and live. Yet we see Moses and God speak face to face without death falling upon Moses.
The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp, but his young aide, Joshua son of Nun, did not leave the tent.
Strange, but what else is strange is how culturally a god turning their back on his worshippers is not a good thing.
Like the east wind, I will scatter them before the enemy. I will show them my back, not my face, in the day of their calamity. They have turned their backs to me and not their faces. He despairs as he rails against his stiff-necked and stiff-backed people.
Hold up. Is God pissed off at Moses here? Moses asked for God to show him so that he was pleased with him. God decides to show him his back. We all understand this language in our modern society. When someone turns their back on you, this means they betrayed you or may not find you a true friend. Also, turning one's back can leave one vulnerable to all sorts of issues. Our posture and body language play significant roles today, as they did in the ancient Southwest Asia and Egypt. Look at men who lift weights, always chest out, flexing, back straight, with swag, trying to show dominance and intimidation. Well, the same can be said about a straight back with deities back then. When we slump, we show defeat, or often, when people are actually defeated, they slump over. Look at the description of Baal fighting Yam in Ugaritic myth. Baal subdues Yam, the sea god. It says, Yam goes groggy, falls to the ground, his joints go slack, his body slumps. Same shows up with the goddesses Atharah and Anat when facing terrifying enemies or devastating news. Her back muscles snap, her vertebrae rattle, her spine goes weak. But Moses was promised by God to see his back parts, or hindquarters, which Francesca expresses is the same term used for an animal's butt, which is to be cleaned before a sacrifice. In simple terms, God protects Moses, where he only catches a glimpse of his butt because he can't see the glory of kabod, which is his very essence, his holy fire, a sign of the divine. Like the kabod in the Bible, we see Asher's malamu, which refers to his luminous, fiery radiance of divinity as seen in this image. This radiance of divinity can be seen with the goddess Ishtar, aka Inanna, when she is seen in ancient art holding her bow standing in triumph. This art spans back into the 1800s BCE. Let's look at an image of King Hammurabi while Dr. Stavrakopoulou explains this in her own words.
The famous Hammurabi stela, now in the Louvre, is better known for its cuneiform law code drawn up by King Hammurabi of Babylon, c. 1792-1750 BCE, but it also offers a striking illustration of divine radiance. In an image carved in relief at the top of the stela, Hammurabi enshrines his self-proclaimed role as the King of Justice in a scene depicting his meeting with Shamash, the Babylonian sun god and divine dispenser of justice. The king stands before the deity, who is seated in splendor on his imposing throne, his feet resting on a footstool of mountains. From Shamash's broad shoulders rise his signature motif of illuminating radiance, thick rays of light, akin to those that would encircle the Assyrian god Ashur's body almost a millennium later. The polished stone of the stela may be cool, black basalt, but the shimmering heat of Shamash's powerful body is almost palpable.
For thousands of years, people have believed that gods had a special glow, like a halo or aura. At first, people thought this glow came from magical items given to the gods, like glowing weapons or cloaks. As time went on, the glow itself became a sign of divine being, just like how skin color can be a strong part of someone's identity today. Take the ancient god Marduk, for example. He was known as the Bright One because he was said to shine with the power of 10 gods and had a special glowing presence. In temples, this glow was shown with statues made of shiny metals like gold and silver, which were considered very holy and connected to the heavens. These metals and precious stones used for making gods' statues were thought to be special gifts from the gods, hidden in the earth for people to find. Kings like Asherah of Assyria believed these materials had a divine source, like gold that had never been used before and special stones from far-off mountains. This divine glow wasn't just for show, it was also of kind of powerful energy. Some gods, like Nergal and Ishtar, were said to wear this glow-like armor. Ishtar even claimed her glow was so strong it could cook fish in the sea. On land, the glow of a god was so overwhelming and overpowering it could make entire lands and people surrender. The gods' fearsome glow could also be seen in their monstrous helpers. In the famous story of Gilgamesh, the hero meets scorpion men, who are bizarre and terrifying creatures that guard the mountains with their scary, glowing presence. In the Bible, God's glow is described with an incredible mix of bright light, fiery brilliance, reflective shine, and a powerful force that is almost like a weapon. God is said to wear light as if it were clothes and to be dressed in majesty and beauty. In English, these descriptions might sound like fancy words used to talk about something amazing, but in the original Hebrew of the Bible, these words are very specific and mean a real shining brightness that comes from God. In the book of Habakkuk, there's a poem that shows just how intense and powerful God's shining presence is, picturing him as a warrior. It says that God's light shines from a sacred mountain in the wilderness, and as he moves towards the world of humans, his light is so bright that it outshines the sun and the moon.
His splendor covers the heavens, and the earth is full of his radiance. He has rays coming out from his hand. The mountains see you and quake, waters gush torrents, the deep roars aloud, raising its hand aloft. Sun and moon stand still at the light of your arrows speeding by the gleaming splendor of your flashing spear. You stride the earth in fury, crushing naons in rage.
The brightness that comes from God is not just impressive, but it can be dangerous too, just like a sword that can both protect and harm. This is probably why the Bible often warns people about getting too close to God's shining presence. For instance, in the book of Isaiah, people who are impressed by the shining gold and silver of statues from other religions are told they should either follow God's own light or hide from the powerful glow of his anger. It's so intense that they're advised to go into the rocks and cover themselves with dust to escape his majestic and frightening brightness. Moses had to be careful. When he wanted to see God on the sacred mountain, God told him how to stay safe because seeing God directly could be overwhelming. Now it all makes sense. It's also really interesting to see Moses come down from the mountain having transformed with horns or lights coming from his face. This is a fun idea to tackle because it has been debated for ages. It could mean light, as we see the context of brilliance from God reflecting off Moses, but it could also mean horns, which is a sign of divinity. Many gods were horned in antiquity, and either way you slice it, Moses was more divine than human when he left that mountain. Later in Jewish thought, the idea of walking in light was walking in God's favor, and enemies were children of darkness, as seen by the Dead Sea sects and the New Testament. Angels of shining glory in Christ, seen in Revelation with hair white as wool and eye blazed with fire. Need I dwell on the transfiguration scene? The Christian creeds speak of light from light, as the ark continued to reveal halos for saints and of course Jesus himself. This idea of lightness was weaponized to whiteness over time, with racist ideas of European Christians against people not as light as them. Dr. Stavrakopoulou's book spells this out in extensive detail. Inside Out. Long ago in ancient Middle Eastern myths, there was a monster named Huwawa, also known as Humbaba, who was known to be a very scary and powerful being. This monster had a glow about him, with 7 layers of it that made him look very intense. He was massive, like a giant, with strong, bent legs and wild hair. But the most startling thing about him was that his insides were shown on the outside, specifically on his face. Huwawa was famous among those who loved stories because he was the keeper of sacred forests where the gods lived, which we now know as part of Lebanon. The great gods of the time chose him for this job because he looked so fierce, with parts of his body representing the wild and mysterious forces of nature. He was so intimidating that even the hero Gilgamesh and his loyal friend Enkidu were stopped in their tracks when they went into the sacred forest, hoping to find adventure and make a name for themselves that would last forever.
Fear and terror spread through his sinews and feet. He could not move his feet on the ground. The big toenails of his feet stuck to the path.
All sorts of magical divination was done with Huwawa in people's mythology to decipher omens through sheep entrails. He was used as a guardian by some, but Francesca spells out his importance in the ancient world with her book.
As both an agent of divination and the guardian of the divine forest of cedars, Huwawa could guard or give access to the secrets of the gods. His gut-filled face manifested this gatekeeping role in the most visceral way. But the monstrosity of Huwawa's face also embodied the very stuff of fear, a primal emotion, which in ancient Southwest Asia was understood to be located not in the brain, but in the gut. Huwawa was a product of a world in which the internal features of the torso embodied the more subjective aspects of existence. Fear and dread were overwhelmingly sensed in the intestines and most acutely felt in the discomfort and discharge of the bowels, reflecting in part an understanding that emotional upset and physical suffering were barely distinguishable. It is an understanding all too often minimized in the medicalized treatment of the body in the modern world, and yet instinctively reflected in the idioms of our everyday language. We are gutted by disappointment, shit ourselves with fear, and feel sick to our stomachs with worry.
The feeling of despair, lust, excitement, and other intense emotions were both felt by gods and humans in the stomach. To be more precise, they assumed the liver and kidneys. Inside our tummies, particularly in the parts where our digestion and reproduction happen, we often feel strong connections with others. This is where we might feel a tug of sadness or someone else's troubles, the warmth that comes with caring about others, or the deep love a parent has for their child. The feelings that we need to think about more, like when we have regrets, feel spiteful, are pleased with ourselves, happy, sad, annoyed, or driven to achieve something. These seem to swirl around our hearts. We get a peek into this old way of understanding feelings when we look at stories about gods from long ago in southwestern parts of Asia. There was a goddess named Anat who, when she was winning a battle, was so full of glee that it was like her insides were laughing and her heart was dancing with joy. And there was Marduk, a god from a place called Babylon, who would get so mad about people not following the rules or forgetting their religious practices that his whole body would shake with rage and his insides would feel like they were on fire with anger. Sounds like he might, need a little anger management, but I bet Yahweh does as well. These ancient tales tell us that even the God mentioned in the Bible felt his emotions in a deep physical way, right in the middle of his body. I hope you're catching the drift in this documentary. In every way, the other gods from the ancient world behaved, felt, had physical attributes, sexual desire, hate, love, lust, etc. The biblical God is seen to do just as much. It should be said, those who want to run down the anachronistic theological gymnastic allegory poop shoot for the biblical God might as well apply all the same features to the endless deities from antiquity. The next time you run into someone spewing that, tell them to get Dr. Francesca Stavrakopoulou's work. It can educate those willing to honestly learn, but it can't cure stubbornness. Well, in the 6th century BCE, Jeremiah describes Yahweh's insides.
My innards, I writhe in pain. Oh, the walls of my heart beats wildly. I cannot keep silent. I hear the sound of the trumpet, the alarm of war. Disaster overtakes disaster. The whole land is laid waste. Suddenly my tents are destroyed, my curtains in a moment.
These passages describe a feeling of deep physical pain that is similar to the sorrow felt by gods in old stories from Southwest Asia. In those tales, gods are said to cry, moan, and double over from the emotional pain of seeing their cities destroyed and their temples disrespected. Their hearts would beat quickly with sadness and anger or feel heavy with regret. However, most people who study the Bible and explain its content have traditionally thought that these words were meant to show the feelings of the prophet Jeremiah, not the God he speaks about. It seems more common to hear about God feeling sad or crying out in pain in the Bible, but it's a different thing to imagine him with stomach pains or a racing heart because he's upset. Yet in the Bible, God's inner feelings often show up as physical reactions. When he's filled with sorrow, his heart feels sick. When he sadly lets the destruction of a place called Moab happen, his insides groan and shake. When he feels pity for the people he loves, you can almost hear his insides making noise. Some people who worship God were so used to these vivid descriptions of his physical reactions that when they stopped, they thought it meant God had physically left them. They would ask where his passion and might had gone, the stirring of his inner feelings, his mercy. They felt those had been held back, and they pleaded for him to return and remember his servants and come back to them. Francesca highlights something important.
Regular lamentation was so fundamental to the workings of a temple that in Mesopotamia, the lamenting musician, Gala, was given his own mythological origins. Equipped with a drum in his hand, the Gala was created by the clever god Enki precisely to appease the wrathful heart of the fearsome goddess Inanna. He fashioned for her the Gala, the one whose lament soothes the heart. He arranged his tearful laments of supplication. The sound of these sacred drums not only echoed the lamenters' ritualized beating of their breasts, a widespread mourning action still employed today in grieving for the Jerusalem temple on Yom Kippur, but conceptually and audibly amplified the beating of the deity's heart, gradually bringing the thumping chests of worshippers and the deity into calmer, syncopated harmony.
Yahweh was no different than Enki in encouraging lamenters for soothing his heart and the other gods.
This is what the Lord Almighty says. Consider now, call for the wailing women to come, send for the most skillful of them. Let them come quickly and wail over us till our eyes overflow with tears and water streams from our eyelids.
The way the ancient stories talk about gods and the people praying to them shows us that calming and quieting the hearts of the gods was taken quite seriously and wasn't just a fancy way of speaking. Just as the worshippers used their bodies to make their prayers feel more real and intense, the bodies of the gods were thought to react in a deeply physical way too. This wasn't just an idea for the lesser-known deities. The god mentioned in the Bible was seen in much the same way. For instance, when enemy forces threatened the city of Samaria around the late 700s before the Common Era, it wasn't just the loud prayers of people that made God feel merciful. It was as if their cries reached inside him, stirring his very organs to compassion.
How can I give you up? How can I hand you over, O Israel? He asks, as he wonders whether to avert his impending punishment of his people. My heart recoils within me, he continues, while a convulsion of compassion in his belly rises up warm.
God felt just like humans felt, which is exactly how all the other ancient Southwest Asian deities functioned. Most people today miss the corporeal and physical nature of the Bible's language pertaining to God, but might get it when thinking of humans. All this heart talk really brings the hardening of the heart idea to life in a whole new way, or the idea of God, Yahweh, guiding the hearts of the kings, directing the path that they should go. Marduk and Yahweh both are said to search out the hearts of rulers with an interesting twist in history. The Persian king Cyrus had an inscription where he himself claims Marduk analyzes the insides of mortals looking for one that matches his own.
All through the lands together, he searched out, tested, and looked for an upright ruler who matched the urgings of his heart. He called out his name, Cyrus, king of Anshan. He pronounced his name to be king over all the world. And he, Cyrus, shepherded with justice and righteousness all the black-headed people over whom he, Marduk, had given him victory.
Well, we see Yahweh from the book of Isaiah claim that it was actually him who called Cyrus's name and made him king to fulfill God's intentions within his heart, literally naming Cyrus his Messiah. Cyrus gets the last word in 2 Chronicles.
Cyrus declares, Yahweh, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has charged me with building him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may Yahweh his God be with him. Let him go up to worship in Jerusalem.
While Yahweh and Marduk may have been enemies in some ways, they shared the same tempo in their hearts towards Cyrus. And just as a side note, I think it's really funny to take the biblical account as if it's more accurate about Cyrus, meaning Cyrus literally says it was Marduk, but some random other writer gets to say which god it was that was the one who sought out his insides to help him win against his enemies. I just find that ridiculous and gullible to believe the Bible over the actual inscription done by King Cyrus about his own experience claiming that the divinity he worshipped was the one who deserved the credit. But I digress. Francesca brings up so many fun facts about the Bible most have never noticed.
It is probably for this reason that in Exodus 28, Yahweh's high priest is commanded to wear a chest covering over his heart, known as the Holshan Mishpat, breastpiece of decision. Crafted with expensive blue, purple, and crimson fabrics and embellished with gold, the breastpiece is filled or studded with 12 precious stones, each inscribed with the name of one of the tribes of Israel. This chest covering appears to have been a part of the high priest's divinatory toolkit, along with divine lots known as Urim and Thummim, which were kept inside its pocket. The Urim and Thummim were used to divine the will of the deity, a key function of a priest who was appointed by Yahweh to do according to what is in my heart.
Then she goes on to shatter the idea that Yahweh was the first and true God who created all things, etc. One of my favorite quotes from Francesca.
And Heduanna exclaims, in this poem, Inanna not only governs the forms of wisdom graciously bestowed upon mortals, such as expertise in warfare, ritual, economics, sex and medicine, but curates and controls the divine wisdom underpinning the very foundations of the cosmos, to destroy, to create, to cut apart, to establish. Inanna are yours, to turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man. Inanna are yours, a large and expansive heart. Inanna are yours. Almost 2,000 years later, another poet was crediting just one deity with the wisdom to create and destroy, and for him, it was Yahweh.
Divine wisdom has always been thought of as something far beyond what humans can understand, something truly set apart from human knowledge. Even the smartest of ancient humans, like the famed King Solomon, who gathered vast amounts of knowledge, didn't come close to the profound understanding attributed to gods. To think a human could match this was seen as a grave mistake. The point is driven home in the Bible during the 6th century BCE, when God, known as Yahweh, speaks through the prophet Ezekiel. He delivers a fierce rebuke to an unnamed king who had become so proud of his own wisdom that he considered himself a god and attempted to claim God's authority for himself. Yahweh's response to this king is a sentence of death, a stark warning against human arrogance.
You have said, I am a god, I sit in the seat of the gods. Because you compare your heart with the heart of a god, I will therefore bring strangers against you, the most terrible of the nations. They shall thrust you down to the pit, and you shall die a violent death. Will you still say, I am a god, in the presence of those who kill you?
Ezekiel continues with this myth related to this king who was too proud in his heart.
You were in Eden, the garden of the gods, Yahweh says to him, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty.
The king lets this get to his head. Well, more like his heart. And God continues,
your heart was proud because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor.
In a more familiar tale, the old stories of a king climbing to heaven are swapped for the story of the first man and woman, Adam and Eve. They lived in a beautiful garden made by God, but there were things they weren't allowed to have. There were 2 special trees in the garden. One had fruit that could make you very wise if you ate it, and the other had fruit that could make you live forever Remember, both were forbidden. But Adam and Eve didn't listen to this rule. They ate from the first tree. Suddenly they knew a lot, feeling almost like gods themselves. But because they might eat from the second tree and never die, God sent them away from the perfect garden to live normal lives that would one day end. This story is so famous that we sometimes miss a key point. Adam and Eve didn't just break the rule about not eating from the tree. They also ate food that was meant to be only for the gods, which was a big no-no. The punishment they got was cleverly linked to what they did wrong. Adam would have to work really hard on tough land to grow his food instead of enjoying the easy-to-grow crops in the garden. Eve would have to deal with the pain when she had babies and always want her husband. The snake, who had encouraged them, didn't lose his legs. He never had any, but was cursed to slide on his belly eating dust. The story shows that in the ancient Southwest Asia, everyone knew that you shouldn't mess with the gods' food. They were super protective, very picky, and did not easily forgive those who messed with their meals. The God in the Bible felt the same way. From belly to bowel. Francesca gives a very vivid, detailed description of Samaritans, who are the only modern Yahweh-worshipping group of long-standing Israelite pedigree, explaining how they have the advantage of being able to sacrifice on their altar at Mount Gerizim, unlike Jews, who haven't been able to do so since Rome's destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 CE. In the holy books of both the Samaritans and the Jews, there's a special meal called the Passover. This meal involves a sacrifice to God, also known as Yahweh, and is eaten quickly to remember how the Israelites had to leave Egypt in a hurry a long time ago. They put the blood of lambs on the sides of their doors because they believed it would keep their firstborn children safe. That night, a deadly force sent by God called the Destroyer went through Egypt and targeted the firstborn sons of their enemies, but it passed over the houses with the lamb's blood. This scary event made the Pharaoh so upset and frightened that he finally let the Israelites go. Francesca suggests that if we look back in history, we find that the original meaning and way of doing this sacrifice were quite different from what is described here. I believe Dr. Stavrakopoulou is hinting at the firstborn son human sacrifice to God, but that would take us off track going down that path. However, she does go on to mention,
in Samaritanism, Judaism, and Christianity, the Passover meal is the central act of an ancient scriptural story articulating a distinctive community identity, but at its heart is a much older agricultural celebration of firstborn animals in which a community's deities were given their portion of the flocks and herds they had rendered fertile. In a pastoral agrarian economy in which ordinary families depended on domesticated animals primarily for their wool, hides, milk, dung, and traction power, the slaughter of a young animal for meat was infrequent enough as to be rendered sacred. Accordingly, meat was a delicacy for most people and was naturally to be shared with the gods who sustained the flocks and herds. Eating together, worshippers and gods were bound together socially, creating and maintaining ties forged on reciprocal hospitality.
It's worth mentioning that the oldest written myths about the purpose for creating humans describes their purpose to feed the gods with various foods. They would make them meat, beer, bread, honey, wine, grain, oil, etc. The gods could do this without humans, but it was part of the humans' duty to serve the gods to keep the universe in order. This beautiful alabaster bowl shows us a picture of how growing crops, hard work, and religious worship were all connected. Around the bottom of the bowl, there's a carving of water with neat rows of barley growing from it. Above that, there's a picture of sheep and goats walking in line. In the middle part of the bowl, there are carvings of men without clothes, who are priests, carrying baskets and jugs full of harvested food as part of a religious parade. The top part of the bowl shows a special woman who might be a goddess or a woman serving as the goddess's symbol inside the temple of the goddess Inanna. She's surrounded by goats and overflowing jugs and baskets of food, which show how important agriculture and offering these goods were in their worship. The Sumerian myths tell it like this: the high gods had lower gods serving them food and working the fields, irrigation, etc. They start throwing fits and complaining, technically protesting. So the high god Enki summons Namu, an other birth goddess, who make humans from wet clay. These humans now fill the role of the lower deities. Later on, we see Marduk doing something very similar. Much later, we see Yahweh planting a garden called Eden with waterways to irrigate it so food could grow to eat, including the 2 trees that only the gods could eat at its center. Then Yahweh makes man much like the older Mesopotamian myths, so man would work the garden for God. No sacrifice is mentioned by Yahweh, but soon Abel satisfies his taste buds with a burnt offering a few chapters later. Francesca corrects many who suppose it was only meat that God wanted.
God looks with displeasure upon Cain's offering, not because crops were inherently inferior to livestock as sacrifices, but because Cain neglects to offer the distinctively sacred portion conventionally set apart for divine consumption, the first fruits of the harvest. He sacrifices what is described only as the fruit of the ground. By contrast, Abel sacrifices the cream of his crop, the firstlings of his flock, their fatty parts.
God wants the first everything, but not just the first. He wants the best of it as well. This is a godly or divine distinction.
To consume sacred food without divine permission, like Adam and Eve, or to serve the wrong portion of food, like Cain, was to neglect this carefully constructed distinction and throw the world into disarray by dishonoring the divine.
It's clear that food is a big deal to the gods. Francesca reminds me of that saying, "A way to a man's heart is through his stomach," though she was applying this to the gods. The ancient priest understood the connection of the divine and human experience of food as the same. When the god eats or drinks, the human can rest satisfied, being they are connected. These ancient gods, including Yahweh, craved a nice tenderloin steak, just like humans, which connects the two in a feast ritual. In fact, in the ancient Mesopotamian flood stories, the relationship between the divine and mere mortals was shattered, but it was redeemed when the ark hero took his ark animals and made a barbecue offering to the gods. The scent of the meat from the Atrahasis and Gilgamesh epic was intoxicating and addictive to these deities, that they restore the broken relationship with mankind because of the food. We find this exact same idea in Noah's Genesis account when he lands the ark and takes the ark animals, creating an amazing barbecue, which causes God to change his heart towards humanity. It's really interesting to see that food can change God's mind. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird and offering burnt offerings on an altar. When the Lord smelled this pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, "I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done." While it's clear God eats sacrifices, the amount of sacrifices offered in his temple by his worshippers gives hints to Yahweh's massive size. Many of the numbers in the Bible about oxen, sheep, bulls, rams, lambs, etc. for the yearly festival appear to be exaggerated by the scribes. However, the idea of the altar serving as God's dinner table where priests shared the food with him is obvious. Some have tried to suggest God was completely done with burnt offerings and had no interest in the food offered to him. But the context in Isaiah where Yahweh says these things, he is speaking of the unrighteous, or better yet, selfish wealthy who took advantage of the poor. Their offerings were empty gestures to Yahweh. These people needed to start doing right by helping the people they built their riches off of. Meaning, God never stopped wanting burnt offerings. He just wanted them as faithful worshipers who did righteousness. Switching from meat to sacred wine for intoxication, the ancient Sumerian myths have stories of Enki and Ninmah getting drunk and competing with each other as they celebrated the creation of the first mortal. It sounds like people who are born with deformities were possibly crafted by the deity while they were intoxicated. Also, we find in ancient Ugarit a myth of El getting drunk and going into the underworld, which is taboo. But he does it and comes back from this death or drunken slumber. Francesca points out that this exclusive drinking club called Marzea, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, was what it was called in the 14th century BCE, Ugarit's story. And wouldn't you know, the Bible was well aware of this drinking club called Marzea, which Yahweh's top worshippers were members of. Amos and Jeremiah described this intoxicating ritual, while others condemned the practice, which later makes Yahweh condemn this practice. Divine dirt.
I will smear shit on your faces, the shit of your festal animals.
This is Yahweh's response to his worshippers who bring in blemished sacrifices in the book of Malachi. In fact, God talks a lot of shit, but in a real way. He means literal poop. The translations like to call it dung or dirt, but it's fecal matter. Dr. Stavrakopoulou gives extensive background or historical information about the function of dirt or poop in ritual and non-ritual settings. I would just like to show how the Bible reflects Yahweh's attitudes towards things he finds displeasure. Take, for example, in the book of Nahum, how Yahweh takes credit for destroying Nineveh in 612 BCE, which is an Assyrian city, though he had nothing to do with it. This warrior deity jabs at what appears to be the goddess Ishtar, and with violent language about lifting up her skirt for all to see her hidden places, if you know what I mean. Yahweh says,
I will throw shit all over you and disfigure you and make you a spectacle.
Take the battle of the gods scene with Elijah, where Baal battles Yahweh with their worshippers calling upon their gods. The 450 Baal worshippers go first, setting up the altar, trying to have their god light it with fire. They cry out to him all day with nothing but silence in return. Elijah mocks them and their god, suggesting Baal may be on a journey, or he is asleep. Possibly he's pooping. We know how this one ends. Yahweh answers Elijah's call instantly and beats Baal and his worshippers, and they're put to death. The disdain towards other deities by Yahweh's scribes causes them to call these other gods, and forgive my pronunciation, Gilulim, or what we would call shit gods. This is what everyone calls an idol. Francesca comments about what scholars have thought here.
Scholars often suppose this intense attack on cult statues in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE reflects a rejection of the traditional theology of divine bodies in favor of an increasingly immaterial, body-free God, but this was not the case. Shit gods and other divine statues were inferior to Yahweh, not because they had bodies, but because they were dysfunctional and disabled. They were other gods made by human hands, objects of wood and stone that neither see, nor hear, nor eat, nor smell, unlike the able-bodied, responsive God of the Bible, who had seeing eyes, hearing ears, a consuming mouth, and an inhaling nose.
Over time, poop became the absolute unholy and needed to be separated from the divine. Unlike earlier times where Yahweh didn't mind getting his hands and feet dirty, the Jewish group of Essenes wouldn't even poop on the holy day, the Shabbat or Sabbath. However, even when they did go number 2, as we call it, they would cover their butts to keep it out of the sight of God. Jews later wrestled with how to properly poop and what direction to face, all to honor Yahweh. By the time of the 1st century, needing to poop was a sure sign you weren't an angel nor God. This sparked really difficult theological issues for early Christians, whose gospels suggest Jesus ate and drank before and after his resurrection. Did he also need to poop? Yahweh has clearly not needed his daily buffet of animals since the temple's demise. What of Jesus's nature if he needed to eat and poop?
But could God as Jesus really have had an ordinary body stuffed with excrement, as the 2nd century Christian thinker Marcion objected? Would digesting corruptible, decaying macaire render Christ a shit-eating God, as the philosopher Celsus scandalously observed? For many, the idea that Christ's body might produce, contain, and excrete faces was either unbearably or nonsensical.
The wild ideas about Jesus using the bathroom have never really gripped my mind as a Christian, but it was clearly troublesome for those early Christians who saw him as divine in some way. Holy smokes, this is a wild thing in her book. You gotta get it. You gotta get Francesca Stavrakopoulou's book. It's that damn good. The image of God talking shit and making people eat it or become it just shows me how man-made these deities are. They function just like us humans in every day, and those who started making God beyond such things have created unfalsifiable claims of this deity, also distancing the worshippers from the corporeal God he always was. Arms and hands, handedness. I'm telling you, this book by Dr. Stavrakopoulou is fabulous, leaving no stone unturned. She highlights the 3rd century CE Jewish synagogue at Dura, which was discovered in 1932, completely shattered scholarly assumptions that Judaism was during the Roman period against creating images of their biblical characters or even the divine in these sacred spaces. The synagogue was filled with colorful art and, shocking to many, even depicts God's outstretched divine arm, hand, and all. You can go search this synagogue and find God's hand shows up in scenes with Moses, Ezekiel, Elijah, and others. 3 centuries later, we even see this hand of God from a 6th century CE Beit Alpha synagogue in Israel. Beit Alpha Synagogue. I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. Many experts today believe that the hand of God seen in old synagogues was a design borrowed from Greek and Roman art, where it was common to show gods or a heavenly force giving crowns of leaves to emperors as a sign of their authority. So in the synagogues, this hand of God is often thought to just be a symbol of divine power, not actually suggesting that God has a physical form. However, it might be time to look at this differently. The Jewish community in the ancient city of Dura, which was part of the Roman Empire, was known for its mix of different cultures, but the way they painted God's hand in their synagogue wasn't just copying popular art styles. It was actually a very accurate representation of the stories and teachings in the Bible they followed. In those texts, God's hand is often mentioned as a real part of God that shows his involvement in the world. The people of Dura in the 3rd century understood God as being very present and active, like a God who literally reaches out his hand to influence what happens on earth. Just like the most active parts of human bodies are our hands, the same is true of God's. We do so much with our hands that it is more than simply touching. We feel, see, and think with our hands. People without sight or hearing experience things through their hands.
Our handedness not only renders us a species of creative action, doers, but beings of tactile perception, relation and reaction, feelers. I touch, therefore I am. Within the ancient religious imagination, the God of the Bible was no different. He touched, therefore he was. By contrast, a God with unfeeling hands was no God at all. As far as some biblical writers were concerned, any such God could be dismissed as a non-being, an insensate, incomplete, incoherent, unholy idol. In short, a mortal made, hand-craved object devoid of divine essence, like the powerless, incapacitated gods worshipped by foreigners. They have mouths but do not speak. They have eyes but do not see. They have ears but do not hear. They have noses but do not smell. They have hands but do not feel. They have feet but do not walk. It is no wonder God's hands are all over the Bible and the world it presents, and it is usually his right hand that is most active, rendering him a right-handed God. Just like most deities of the ancient Levant, these gods tended to exhibit the same body language. Enthroned in their temples, the gods' statues would hold an open-palmed right hand up to their worshippers. It is a pose beautifully illustrated by the god El in one of his cult statues from Ugarit.
This is El, who is holding his right hand up as a sign of blessing and divine love toward his worshippers. However, this is a common symbol found before El in ancient Egypt to images of Jesus holding his right hand up. You'll find this sign everywhere. All sorts of gods, deities, and images. And of course, most popular, we see Jesus holding the same symbol with his right hand up, a sign of peace, a sign of blessing. Social anthropologists, experts who study human societies and their behaviors, have noticed that in many cultures throughout history and even today, the right hand is connected with positive things. It's the hand people use for eating, making friends, celebrating a new birth, showing someone's high social ranking, and even for good luck. On the other hand, no pun intended, the left hand has some negative associations. It's often linked with death, danger, and bad luck. In many of these cultures, both old and new, the left hand is the one used for less pleasant tasks, like cleaning oneself after going to the bathroom. And in Western culture, the word for the left hand comes from the Latin word for left, which is sinister. Over time, this word has come to mean something evil or bad, showing how deep the negative feelings about the left hand go. In fact, we had many people who were trying to be trained left-handed people who were forced to write with their right hand in history. Sticking with this well-known tradition, Yahweh, just like El before him, uses his right hand to save Israel from Egypt. It's how he removes the native people from Canaan to make way for Israel. God is also portrayed as using his hands like a crafter to create the heavens and the earth, as well as mold the first humans using his hands. Dr. Stavrakopoulou says this really well.
These images conjure the delicate craftsmanship of a gentle-handed deity, and yet, within the Bible's mythology of cosmic origins, they are secondary to his first violent act of creation, in which Yahweh uses his hands and arms as powerful weapons to sharka, smite, pierce, strike, smash, crush, crack, sever, or punch the chaos monster into submission before pinning its watery body beneath his feet. The violence of this battle and its creative consequences are vividly attested in a biblical poem of the 6th century BCE. Here, a description of Yahweh's role as the maker of day and night, summer and winter, and the boundaries of the world is naturally prefaced by his fight with chaos and the repurposing of its watery body. You are the one who smashed Yam, sea, with your might, cracked the heads of the dragons in the waters. You are the one who crushed the heads of Leviathan. You gave him as food for the wild beasts. You are the one who cut openings for springs and streams. You are the one who dried up the mighty rivers. The sea dragon was the most prominent of a primordial cohort of rebellious or disruptive divine monsters at once loved and feared by the ancient gods of Southwest Asia, born of the oldest generation of deities long before the earthly, mortal realm had been formed. These monsters embodied all that was uncontrollable, undomesticated, and uncertain in the cosmos. In the world of myth, where the lines of time did not run straight, but looped about in misshapen circles, battling a chaos monster in hand-to-hand or hand-to-head, combat was essential to the story of the universe, in which an ordered world was necessarily built and sustained upon the gods' ongoing management of disruptive disorder. And as we've seen, it was a conflict far older than the biblical God himself.
You can thank the earlier family of myths, with Baal and Anat from Ugarit, for physically defeating the chaos watery dragon to bring order. A brief mention in the myth praises Anat.
Surely I fought Yam, the beloved of El, she boasts. Surely I bound dragon and destroyed him. I fought the twisty serpent, the seven-headed encircler.
But they really praised Baal as their patron god, who completely defeated Yam's wet body, drinking him away and bringing order to the world.
The cosmic dynamics of his victory are celebrated on the Louvre's famous Baal stela, originally located in or near the deity's temple in Ugarit, showing a triumphant Baal striding across the reordered universe. Under his feet are the mountains of the earthly realm, beneath which are locked the subdued, undulating waters of disorder. His right arm is raised above his head, club in hand, ready to strike should the waters rise up again. In his left hand is a downward-pointing, lightning-tipped spear, its wooden staff budding into leafy life as its blade pierces the boundary between the heavenly and earthly realms.
Just like Baal, Ninurta also faced the dangerous, chaotic, watery dragon from a little image around 2500 BCE, where Ninurta kicks chaotic disorder's ass. Later on, around 1100 BCE, Marduk takes the role of Ninurta and gives the chaotic water dragon Tiamat and her lover Kingu a little ass whooping as well.
He made the bow, appointed it his weapon. He mounted the arrow, set it on the string. He took up the mace, held it in his right hand. Bow and quiver he hung on his arm.
He completely destroys Tiamat in the myth and constructs the universe from her body using his hands. Now comes Yahweh, Johnny come lately, late to the cosmic party of chaos dragon warfare. He uses his strong hand and outstretched arm as a warrior at the Yam Suf, aka Sea of Reeds, where Yahweh is a victorious warrior over watery chaos.
Pharaoh's chariots and his army he cast into the sea Yam. His picked officers were sunk in the Sea of Reeds. Deep Tehom covered them over. Down they went in the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Yahweh, is glorious in strength. Your right hand, O Yahweh, smashes the enemy. At the snort of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The streams stood up in a heap. You blew with your breath. Sea Yam covered them over. They sank like lead in the mighty waters.
The visuals one can see in their mind is of a warrior god and his body in deep combat.
Yours is an arm with might. Your hand is strong. Your right hand raised.
Check out this visual story at Karnak, celebrating Thutmose III's important victory at Megiddo in what is now Israel in 1457 BCE. This godlike pharaoh celebrated his victory with arms high, destroying his enemies at Megiddo. This is the same Megiddo which is supposed to host the final cosmic battle in the end of time. This image alone shows you how these kings and their gods are imitating each other. These divine weapons and warfare against the chaos get defeated by mortals and gods. Arm's reach. When chaos came by way of Babylon, we find an interesting cry from this author.
Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of Yahweh. Awake, as in the days of old, the generations of long ago. Was it not you who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? Was it not you who dried up the sea, Yam, the waters of great deeps, mighty Tehom? Who made the depths of the sea Yam a way for the redeemed to cross over? So the ransomed of Yahweh shall return and come to Zion with singing.
God's arm isn't broke or weak, but was sleeping. He must have purposefully left his people to be defeated. His arm was sleeping, then so was Yahweh. Just like humans need rest, so did the gods. Ancient Sumer shows this as exactly what Enlil did. He caused famine on his own land, then went into Nippur's temple and pretended to be sleeping. Inanna travels from Uruk to try waking him.
Feigning, my father feigns lying down, she cried. May I soothe his heart? May I pacify his liver? May I direct my words to his distressed heart? Sitting on his lap, she sings him awake with a refrain. Oh, sleeping one, how long will you sleep?
This was such an important lament. Her worshippers would cry it every 7th day of the month in Uruk.
Many centuries later, in the 6th century BCE, Yahweh's worshippers were singing petitions to awaken him to the devastating aftermath of the Babylonian attack. Rouse yourself. Why do you sleep, O Yahweh? Awake, do not cast us off forever.
Yahweh would eventually snap out of it and bring his exiles back to rebuild his temple in Jerusalem. At least this is what the Bible wants to tell it as. The hands of God and the chaotic dragon myth continued all the way down into the New Testament mythology. Divine touch. As usual, Dr. Stavrakopoulou highlights how people really lose their minds trying to get these ancient texts to fit their modern perceptions of God. When I say modern, I mean people after the time of Jesus down into the Middle Ages. But you can bank on people in the 21st century also sharing this problem. What problem is that, you may be saying? Moses clearly dies in Deuteronomy with only being able to see the promised land, but not enter it. The Hebrew in Deuteronomy 34:6 says, God buried Moses. It reads like this.
Moses, the servant of Yahweh, died there in the land of Moab at Yahweh's command, and he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab.
What's the problem, Derek? God buries a corpse, which would render him impure, which is contaminating God. This was such a problem for later generations, they changed the text to where it says, he buried him, to he was buried, or they buried him. There you have it. Let's change the words so God isn't the one handling a corpse. This literally goes to show you how ideas evolve and the older traditions go out of fashion. They have lost the reality of their God from his earlier setting. Yahweh, like all these ancient deities, was willing to get his hands dirty, whether that was to bury the dead or help with the birthing of a child. From life to death, their God was actively involved, but the distance from the divine and human world continued to get more distant over time. Imagine the continuous gymnastics that have to happen when one has to change the earlier texts and ideas to fit their modern ideas. Yahweh was known to reach into the underworld with the dead.
Though they dig into Sheol, from there my hand shall take them.
We also see the vivid image of the valley of dry bones, all the dead bones in Ezekiel, and we have actual 8th century BCE inscriptions requesting the protection of the dead.
Blessed be Uriyahu by Yahweh, now from his enemies deliver him by his Asherah. By his Asherah.
You see, this divine hand was a gateway of protection from the God to the dead and the living. We see another example of the divine's gentle touch with Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their daughters. From the sun god Aten's sun rays of touch. Notice carefully, too, the hands, the touch of the rays coming down onto the pharaoh, his wife, the queen, and their daughters. Really, really fascinating how literal they understood the natural world and their deity to have a corporeal essence upon them. The hands in touch was absolutely necessary and part of the worship of ancients. Even Christians today in certain forms of worship raise their hands to the divine as if they are infants wanting to be comfortably picked up by their God and held in the God's warm embrace. The believers today, even with their different understanding of God, want him to actually pick them up with his hands. We see this same idea in the 8th century BCE from the northern Sinai. If you look carefully, you'll notice the worshipers in the middle of this white image are raising their hands up, similar to what we would see in any modern charismatic church today, where they're praising and worshiping their God. This idea of God as a parent loving his children or giving compassion to his lover Israel has biblical roots.
When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. I taught Ephraim to walk. I took him up in my arms.
These ideas are all too common to us as humans. This is exactly how they viewed the divine and how they perceived the divine viewed them.
It is a vivid snapshot of a tender divine love, similarly picked out with a delicate poetic beauty in the book of Isaiah. Vowing never to forget his worshippers, Yahweh asks, can a woman forget her nursing child, or show no compassion for the child of her womb? Speaking the promises whispered by countless generations of parents, he declares, you have been carried by me from birth, lifted from the womb, even to your old age I am he. Even when you turn gray, I will carry you.
Because of these tender-sounding passages, many have tried making the divine genderless or even female. However, even if the idea is a nice one, Francesca points out that Yahweh is not a birth mother, nor female, nor womanly in these texts. She gives an example from a Phoenician inscription from around 825 BCE, which has King Kulamua describing his relationship with his people who are called Mushkabim in a family way.
I was to some a father, and I was to some a mother, and to some I was a brother. I took the Mushkabim by the hand, and they showed me affection, like the affection of a fatherless child towards its mother.
There is something very similar happening with Yahweh, but the scribes go further and have Yahweh dominating the roles of the goddesses, divine midwives, and heavenly wet nurses. These roles were usually carried out by women in the households. With the birthing and breastfeeding activities of mortal women, they have deities who oversaw these activities, and Asherah would have been one of those which was ignored and removed. This issue is really felt when God is seen creating mankind, which was an activity done usually by male and female gods. The Sumerian myth of Enki and Ninmah crafted the first humans from clay. Then you have the myth of Mami and Enki making humans from clay. An Ugaritic myth has El creating an exorcism goddess from clay to cure a king named Kurta.
I shall create a remover of sickness, an expeller of disease. He fills his hands with the best of clay. He pinches off that which is used by a potter.
The Egyptians also had a divine potter named Khnum who made man from his potter's will and clay. The act of making a human or a god from clay was a magical performance.
You are the master of the wheel, who is pleased to model on the wheel. You have made humans on the wheel. You have created the gods. You have modeled the small and large cattle. You have formed everything on your wheel each day in your name, Khnum the potter.
The human worshippers who made images of their gods in human form for their rituals, or when gods made people, it was a magical thing. As we see in Genesis creation, this was a magical craft summoning new life by the divine with the famous, "Let us make man in our image." We all know these passages all too well. What is shocking for some to find out is that Yahweh is a deity who offers sacrifice as well. Francesca says it best here.
Perhaps most remarkably of all, the God of the Bible is also a deity who offers sacrifice. Like many of their scribal forebears across the Levant, the biblical writers are careful to avoid the impression that a deity might offer up a blood sacrifice to another god. To do so would be to compromise the divine sacrificer's godly status. Instead, when the gods prepare and offer a sacrifice, it is quite literally a self-serving ritual, often set within a context of warfare. Casting the human enemy's destruction as a celebratory ritual slaughter, the gods' butchering of bodies, evisceration of innards, and splattering of blood functions much like an animal sacrifice. The blood purifies and empowers the space of sacrifice, while the innards and fat are divinely devoured. This is graphically illustrated in a description of Yahweh's onslaught against the citizens of Bozrah in Edom. Yahweh has a sword. It is sated with blood. It is gorged with fat, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of kidneys and rams. For Yahweh has a sacrifice in Bozrah, a great slaughter in the land of Edom. Wild oxen shall fall with them, and young steers with the mighty bulls. Their land shall be soaked with blood, and their soil made rich with fat. In many ways, Yahweh's ritual activities were not so different from those of other deities across the ancient world, who not only swore vows, offered sacrifices, and poured out libations, but purified themselves, experienced visionary dreams, performed exorcism rites, and uttered magical incantations. But as time went on, and as the religious lives of his worshippers were increasingly aligned to the regulations set out in their sacred text, so too God's personal piety fell into line with his worshippers' ritual practices. By the time the highly authoritative Book of Jubilees had been composed in the 2nd century BCE, God himself was keeping Shabbat every week with his angels and his people, as he had always done, apparently.
In Jewish thought, what you start seeing happening over time is God starts to look and act more and more in line with the clever rabbinic interpretations, where God wears tefillin. And this seems to be what happens, is God adapts and molds to the culture of the human, hinting again at the human origins and perceptions of the deity. And you have this tug of war amongst worshipers who are conservative on an idea that they say, no, we need to hold on to these older ideas, and the new ideas culture is pushing forward. And the deity, depending on who's writing the text, is really the perception of the scribe or the person who's trying to push a particular agenda. Very propagandistic, political, and of course, very human. Holy handbooks. Dr. Stavrakopoulou has a way with her writing that makes you really visualize everything so clear. As she ventures into describing the sacredness of holy literature, she points out a supposed miracle where a church burns and not a single Bible or cross burned in the process. The miraculous nature of the Word of God and how the three Abrahamic faiths venerate their sacred literature on a holy level, while Christianity doesn't do it on the same level as the Quran or the Torah for Muslims and Jews. It still matters and is very important for Christians. The Bible has always held a sacred status, even among the Orthodox churches, which is exactly how Jewish Torah scrolls were seen in synagogues. This revelatory material is seen as powerful objects. Francesca goes into great lengths describing how God wrote his laws with his finger in the stone for Israel with Moses. There are hints of God writing a book himself that he could blot people out of as well. The point is that Francesca is showing the absurdity of not getting the clear corporeal portrayal of God by these ancients, not only from the Bible itself, but the endless examples from its earlier cultural predecessor in Canaan, from Ugarit, with the same named deity, but the broader Southwest Asian world of gods who talk, walk, smell, feel, hate, love, and act exactly the same as Yahweh. These gods and those receiving the revelation were were everywhere in this period. She goes into great depths of explaining this with Hammurabi and Shamash, Ea or Enki, and several Assyrian and Babylonian kings. They had books where those gods wrote down things as well, which is exactly what Yahweh does. Daniel mentions God's handwriting on the wall, to Revelation having the Lamb's Book of Life whose names are written in it. By who? By God. Now, if all of this is allegory and all of this is metaphor, then anything goes. We all can just keep on twisting, turning, and not ever know what the original context is. This is why I love her book. She's taken us back to what the earliest people writing and scripting this and helping us to try. And even trying, you're never going to fully get it because we're not them. Their culture is so distant from ours, to try and actually understand exactly in every way that they did, that I doubt is possible. Unless we went back in time and lived amongst them and understood and practiced the things they did. However, we can come much closer to the reality of what was meant and realize what has happened over time if we pay a close attention. This whole Holy Handbook section ultimately also shows you how this progression from the corporeal God ends up becoming the corporeal literature. And God kind of gets replaced by the literature, and he becomes the distant philosophical deity that somehow has escaped any falsification. Face to face. The Jericho skull is an example of people across the Levant creating magical images of extraordinary beings that people experience face to face. Nothing is more social in human society than speaking face to face with somebody. We are built with facial recognition neurologically in the womb, and faces are extremely important for connection. She moves into a section called God gazing, and over in the Bible, the writer expresses people vocalizing they want to meet or see God face to face.
When shall I come and behold the face of God? I shall behold your face. I shall take my fill, wide awake, of your image.
If we look at the countless temples in ancient Southwest Asia, you will find that the people visiting them would see the divine image of their god or gods and come face to face with that deity, which evoked a deeply sincere experience for the devotees. Francesca points out a Babylonian king restored the sun god Shamash's cult statue and depicts coming face to face with God circa 860 to 850 BCE. As we have pointed out previously, Moses experiences this face-to-face experience with God. Moses literally sees Yahweh and spends 40 days and nights with him on that mountain. This literal corporeal experience transforms Moses' face. Francesca brings this home powerfully.
Other Yahweh worshippers also felt the visceral transformative power of seeing their God. In a psalm, one describes the encounter as the stark difference between famine and feast. My throat thirsts for you, my flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water, he exclaims. So I looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your strength and glory. My throat is sated with fat and fatness. The deity, too, was likely sated by this meeting, for worshippers were not to turn up to temples without gifts of food. 3 times a year, all your males shall see the face of Yahweh, your God, at the cult place that he shall choose. Moses commands the Israelite, they shall not see the face of Yahweh empty-handed. All shall give as they are able. Looking upon the face of God was the very purpose of a temple, as Yahweh makes clear in the ancient Greek translation of the book of Exodus. You shall make me a sanctuary, and I shall be seen among you.
Yahweh desired people to seek his face. All this language of seeking and seeing his face, it's almost as if he wants you to see his face. I mean, seriously, at what point do we stop trying to reinterpret this to mean something other than his actual face, like all the other gods?
Seek my face, he called to his worshippers. Come before his countenance, his ritual singers urged.
Francesca goes on and points out, while this is shocking to most readers, translators are partly to blame when they soften the solid instruction to seek his face, seek his presence. You can also see why when books like Deuteronomy say the Israelites heard God but didn't see his body, or the Gospel of John when it says no one has ever seen God. We see this in 1 Timothy as well.
God dwells in unapproachable light, and no one has ever seen him or can see him.
However contradictory it is, Moses did see God, and so did other biblical characters. These are likely competing traditions battling out their ideas of the divine. These temple priests of Yahweh would have limited the viewing of God's face to face only to special people inside of the temple they approved. Add to that the dangers of seeing the divine where they needed to properly prepare to visit him face to face. Outside of the temple is rife with deadly hazard, as Moses and Jacob encountered. Moses was saved by Zipporah's fast acting on circumcising their child with the blood ritual of their child. So Yahweh didn't kill Moses. And then there's Jacob wrestling God, eventually letting go, naming the place Peniel, which is face of God.
I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved.
One note is this. Of course, neither does Francesca or MythVision believe that Moses actually saw God, because we don't think he existed. The author is writing this in a real way, a real corporeal perception of this activity taking place with Jacob, with Moses, the stories of the heroes of the Bible and such. So in a very real sense, the author wants you to see that this is what they're implying, a corporeal experience. And of course, later centuries, they do exactly what we've been discussing on taking God and making him disappear. The fertile god Dagon also has face-to-face encounters with his worshippers, and she goes into that in her book. The next section she gets into is hide and seek. The gods could even hide their face from you. This was also seen as a horrible thing. There are several examples biblically of Yahweh hiding his face from his worshippers, but you also find this with Ugaritic gods of Baal, El, and Asherah, and of course Yahweh and Asherah. The brightness of the gods' shining faces was always longed for by devotees.
May Yahweh bless you and guard you. May Yahweh make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May Yahweh lift up his face upon you and give you peace.
Headstrong beauty. One of my personal favorite sections in her book, God and Anatomy, is this section. Technically, all of the sections are absolutely fantastic, but this section vindicates my endless horned images of gods or divine figures on my YouTube video thumbnails. How pretty good looking the divine really is and was always mentioned that way. In fact, as far back as the earliest goddess depictions of Inanna, she goes through the underworld shedding ornaments of her divine image and all its perfections. Francesca says it best.
The uncultured, corporeal completeness of divinity is perhaps nowhere better expressed than in a Sumerian myth about Inanna herself. It tells of her descent to the underworld, the realm ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. It is an aggressively ambitious attempt to claim the underworld for herself, and she confidently plans to defy its nature as the land of no return by leaving again. But when she arrives, she is appalled to learn that she must be ceremonially stripped of her 7 powers of divinity as she passes through the 7 gateways leading to her sister's throne room. At the first gate, her horn turban is removed. At the second, her lapis lazuli necklace. At the third, the string of egg-shaped beads decorating her breast. By the time she has passed through the 6th gate, she has lost her glittering pectoral, her golden finger ring, and her lapis lazuli toolkit, the measuring rod and line with which she apportions justice. Finally, at the 7th gateway, she is deprived of her robe, the garment of ladyship. Crouching and naked, she has been robbed of her upright, forthright divinity, the very essence of her heavenly personhood. She is wholly diminished, but things are about to get worse. Although she seats herself on her sister's throne, she is not there for long. The divine denizens of the underworld assault her body further. They stare at her with the look of death. They speak to her with words of anger, and they bellow at her with the shout of shame. Bludgeoned by these incantations, she is turned into a corpse, and in a nightmarish detail, her corpse is hung on a hook. But all is not lost. The wise god Enki crafts a rescue party from the clay caught under his fingernails, who retrieve Inanna's corpse from its hook and revive her with the balm of Enki's life-giving plant and a sprinkling of his life-giving water. As she leaves, Inanna secures her release with a promise she will be replaced in the land of death by a substitute. She decides it will be her lover, the fertile shepherd god Dumuzi, who had rather foolishly failed to grieve for her sufficiently. He will spend half the year in the underworld in her place, much as Persephone will do in later Greek versions of the myth. Mournful but but resolute, Inanna returns from the underworld to ornamented glory in the heavenly realm.
Jeez, that's a wild myth of the corporeal reality of these deities. Crown of horns. Francesca points out the oldest bodily features of God were bull horns upon his head.
God, who brought Israel out of Egypt, has horns like a wild ox. He destroys nations who oppose him. He crushes their bones.
She points out that modern cultures think of horns on beings' heads as evil or gross, with Satan or the devil to the bull-headed minotaur in Greek mythology. However, in the most ancient world of gods, horns manifested the highest degree of divinity, and most gods had them. They represented order of the universe, often in the shape of a crescent moon. As early as the late 4th millennium BCE, horn caps were a marker of divinity, with this showing upon a cylinder sill. It shows two higher status gods with other deities building a temple gate. If these deities have their caps removed, it could mark the death of the deity, just like the removal of Inanna's articles of clothing led to her temporary death.
The horns of the gods were not confined to Sumer, but soon sprouted on the heads, hats, and turbans of deities across Mesopotamia, Anatolia, Syria, and the Levant, passing from one generation of gods to the next, like a genetic carrier of divinity traveling down the ages. By the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, the pedigreed horns of heaven were atop the head of the Levantine high god El, the cultural father of the God of the Bible. At Ugarit, El's horns were fashionably changeable, depending on the skills, influences, and location of the artisans crafting his cult images.
Even El from Ugarit is described as wearing bull horns, and his children birthed by the two young goddess wives also are birthed with horns of heaven, as El says.
May they have horns like bulls and humps like steers.
And Baal points out that El's older children, including the goddess Anat, have horns as well.
The horns of your power, girl Anat. The horns of your power let Baal anoint.
Baal also had radiant horns like lightning bolts flashing, being he was a storm god. Should it shock anyone that the older traditions in the Bible about God, he is seen as a divine bull with horns and all.
Let them come on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the head of the prince among his brothers, the firstborn of his divine bull. Majesty is his. His horns are the horns of a wild ox. With them he gores peoples, driving them to the ends of the earth.
In some ancient places of worship dedicated to the god Yahweh, this god wasn't just pictured with special horns that symbolized power from above, but was also shown as a mighty bull. The historical writings known as the Book of Kings tell us that there were golden bull statues in the temples of Bethel and Dan. Those are temples where their god was. The prophet Hosea also talks about a statue made of gold and silver that people honored in Samaria, the main city of Israel back then. Even though the prophet Hosea was pretty upset about people paying so much attention to this statue, it's pretty clear he's hinting that the statue represented Yahweh, the main god of Samaria. These golden statues might have looked like a small bronze bull found at a religious site from the 1200s BCE in the area where Israel would later be established. Or they could have resembled a figure from the 700s BCE that showed a god with a bull head found in a city not too far away. Yahweh's bull-like features were really important in the art of most important northern temples. When enemies from Assyria came and overpowered Israel in the 700s BCE, these bull images were easy to make fun of. After this disaster happened to the people in the north, writers in Jerusalem, which was in the south, started to describe these bull statues as nothing more than shameful animal images. This is how we got the story of the infamous golden calf that caused so much trouble for the Israelites at Sinai with Moses. Profile. The god El, seen in ancient Ugaritic mythology, was gray, bearded, and wise, which wasn't a sign of his decline towards frailty, rather his shining wiseness. We see this described in the book of Daniel for Yahweh, who usurped El's throne and took on the characteristics of the Ancient of Days, or Father of Years, as seen in El. This white beard on Yahweh puzzled Jewish scholars. Did their ancestors encounter God as a youthful warrior or a wise old old man. Rabbis solved this riddle by asserting that God could change forms depending on the revelation he wanted to present. Solving this conundrum prevented the idea that there were two gods, or that time brought age to God. Enoch describes God as the Ancient of Days, who had hair white as wool with garments indescribable. However, these attributes were attributed to Jesus in the book of Revelation, which pointed to the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man, as Daniel and Enoch suggests. For John in Revelation, God and Jesus were identical in looks and equal in power. This is presented in the Philippians hymn for Jesus as well. Though he saw not being equal with God something to grasp, he humbled himself, yet God raises him up and of course seats him at the right hand, giving him equal power with the Father. Dr. Stavrakopoulou goes deep into the visual perceptions of Christian art as well as descriptions of the divine for rabbis. She tackles the difficulties Christians faced with profiling God's face with the fracturing camps which developed over time. Some would portray Christ with white hair as depicted in Revelation, while others painted Jesus younger like other demigods and the Greek world or philosophers. There's so much ground covered here by her. I think this deserves your attention to this section by reading the book for yourself. Sense and sensitivity. The ancients understood the voice of their gods to be a real manifestation of something concrete and physical. Francesca describes how natural phenomena were often understood as the voices of monsters or gods, from which mythical motifs were spun around. Baal's voice could be heard thundering in the heavens.
Kuthar Wahasis laughed. He opened his voice and cried, "Did I not say to you, O valiant Baal, that you would return, Baal, to my suggestion? Let a window be opened in the house, a casement in the midst of the palace." Baal opened a rift in the clouds. His holy voice Baal gave forth. Baal repeated the issue of his lips. At his holy voice the underworld quaked. At the issue of his lips the mountains were afraid. The ancient mountains were afraid. The hills of the earth tottered.
Just as Baal would give his mighty voice from the mountaintop palace, Yahweh would be seen doing the same thing, which wasn't just audible, but was also physical.
The voice of Yahweh is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. Yahweh is over the mighty waters. The voice of Yahweh in power. The voice of Yahweh in majesty. The voice of Yahweh breaks the cedars. Yahweh breaks the cedars of Lebanon. The voice of Yahweh flashes forth flames of fire.
This is also what we see at Sinai with Yahweh and Moses. Yahweh thundering flashes of lightning and great flames. Babylonian Marduk is said to have kindled fire by the moving of his lips. She moves into a section called selective hearing. I find it really fun reading Francesca's description of how God listened to his worshipers singing praises to him, and sometimes he would want them all to just shut up. He wanted silence. Of course, the writer is trying to suggest he isn't happy with his worshipers for some reason, their wrongdoings. But it's so vivid reading how God's ears could hear, and they were literally annoyed by the noise. Very corporeal.
"Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps."
He might even be seen covering his ears and not listening to their prayers.
"Do not shut your ear to my cry for help, but give me relief," pleaded one fretful petitioner. "Do not hide your face from me in the day of my distress. Incline your ear to me. Answer me speedily," begged another.
She shows in her book a drawing of ears of Yahweh on a coin from the 4th century BCE. However, getting the attention of God's ear to listen to you is best attested in the well-known psalm.
My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far away from helping me and from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but find no rest.
Francesca is hilarious, pointing out God's selective hearing, where Hagar cried out to God after being banished with her son. God clearly didn't listen or couldn't hear her, but her son Ishmael's cry, well, he could hear that. Interesting note is Ishmael means God hears. Well, isn't that a coinkadink?
"What troubles you, Hagar?" says a divine messenger dispatched to her aid. "Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of the boy."
Maybe God couldn't hear Hagar or didn't want to, and decided to respond to Ishmael. But people who talked crap behind God's back really got his attention.
"How long shall this wicked congregation complain against me?" he demands of Moses and Aaron. "I have heard the complaints of the Israelites, which they complain against me," he says, vowing to kill the naysayers before the journey's end.
She moves to eye of the beholder. The physical touch of the gaze gets described in excellent detail as God's eye, or even the eyes of the divine, are perceived as watching. Women are to wear head coverings to protect them from the gaze of the angels. angels. We don't want them pulling another Genesis 6 now, do we? Remember, the Apostle Paul encouraged that because he thought that the demon angels would come down and possibly take advantage of these girls. Also, the gaze described by Genesis about Ham looking or seeing his father's nakedness. Notice that Ham's brothers turn around to cover their father so they don't see his family jewels. Let's not forget being the apple of God's eye, or his eyes being said to watch his land and observe his worshippers' righteousness.
Under God's unrelenting gaze, Job's skin burns, blisters and peels, his flesh disintegrates, his organs split and leak, his bones threaten to splinter and shatter. He is plagued with terrifying visions and monstrous nightmares. Job decides he has had enough of living, and he has had enough of God's suffocating scrutiny. "Will you not look away from me for a while?" he begs his divine tormentor. "You do not leave me alone while I swallow my spit. What sin have I done to you, you watcher of humanity? Why have you made me your target?" As readers, we are in on God's game, a heavenly wager that no marker the injustice and severity of his afflictions. Job will not curse God. We know Job's suffering is a false punishment for a non-existent sin. Like Job himself, we know he is innocent of any wrongdoing, and so does God. And yet still, Job suffers as God's eyes eat into his body, slowly devouring him in a thoroughly corporeal way. "He has gnashed his teeth at me. My adversary sharpens his eyes against me. He slashes open my kidneys and shows no mercy. He has poured my gall out on the ground." God had become demonic.
Tons of talk about God watching and seeing just as humans see. However, God's vision can have repercussions. This evil eye was sometimes deviated using an amulet, which people know as the Eye of Horus. You want the watchful eyes of your guardian deity instead of an evil one. Yahweh is often depicted with watching over his worshippers, protecting them. Dr. Stavrakopoulou goes into much more detail and information about the eye and how to see this corporeal understanding in the ancient Near Eastern context. Let's just say he has eyes like humans have eyes, and he sees, much greater of course, but on every single level that the humans experience something in a physical corporeal way, God experiences it on a much grander scale. Gasp and gulp. God has a keen sense of smell, as all gods did. Yahweh clearly had a positive sense of smell for animal sacrifice, and as later rabbis discuss, even enjoyed the rotting foreskins of Abraham's household, which smelled like a sweet incense. Very strange to see God so human. What is interesting is how much about the nose is covered, and its importance not only in the world of gods, but also in the ancient world in general. The nose reflects much about anger, as the expanding and contracting nostrils on a human signify facial features of anger.
Reading across biblical texts, a preliminary sign of his growing annoyance is a blocked nose. His airways grow warm with his thickened, heavy breath as the scent of ritual deviancy reaches his nostrils, kindling what Yahweh describes as a smoke in my nostrils, a fire that burns all day long. A second stage is marked by the deity's rapid, noisy breathing as he threatens to lash out. "I will cry out like a woman in labor. I will gasp and pant," he warns, promising that his howling, heated breath will scorch across the landscape, drying up its rivers and shriveling its trees and plants. When God finally explodes with rage, his anger pours out like a molten stream of lava, casting his wrath as a nasal mucus, streaming hot and thick with fiery fury, the flames and smoke of his wrathful breath consuming his enemies. If the deity can sniff out deviant worship, he can snuff out the deviant worshipper. As one biblical poet put it, "By the breath of God they perish, by the wind of his nose they come to an end." The sources of sea, Yam, were exposed, the foundations of the world laid bare at the rebuke of Yahweh, at the blast of the breath of his nostrils.
It's also really interesting to see how swallowing played a significant role with the gods. Mot, or death, swallowing Baal in one gulp, but this would be overcome. The earth was described as swallowing people, but even in Isaiah, Yahweh was the great swallower by swallowing death.
He will destroy the shroud that is cast over all peoples. He will swallow up Mot forever. Turning the tables on Mot, Yahweh will defeat death himself in one great gulp.
Later on, the Apostle Paul and the early Christians saw death as something needing to be defeated. It was a bigger enemy than Satan. This terrible being called Thanatos in Greek was who ruled humanity from Adam till Christ's resurrection. Even though the concept of death being conquered is a cornerstone of Christianity, the old stories about the god Mot, who was known for devouring life, lingered on. In the very first Christian artworks, Jesus' triumph triumph over death wasn't shown with scenes of the cross or his return to life. Instead, artists chose to depict the story of the prophet Jonah. This tale doesn't involve a whale as often thought. Jonah was actually gulped down by a huge fish, thought to be related to the legendary sea creatures of old tales, and then miraculously returned to dry land alive. For the early followers of Jesus, Jonah's incredible journey, where he spent 3 days inside the fish, was seen as a sneak preview of Jesus' own 3 days in the grave. So when these artworks showed the fish spitting Jonah back out, it symbolized a dramatic overturning of death's grip. Jonah was presented as a sign pointing forward to Jesus rising from the dead. The gulp of death is contrasted with the breath of life, which God gives humans in the Bible. I urge everyone to get God and Anatomy, as it goes much further on the topics briefly brought up so far. Pertaining to the concept of God, it was the breath of God that would remain, and his body, well, it would gradually dissolve and vanish. An autopsy. Dr. Francesca Stavrakopoulou has written a masterpiece about God in his original context and beautifully describes him in that corporeal sense. Before diagnosing his death, she says,
"We might find the early blows were struck at the end of the 8th century BCE, when the Assyrians destroyed the northern kingdom of Israel, and at the beginning of the 6th century BCE, when the Babylonians sacked Jerusalem. With the destruction of Yahweh's temples came the loss of its sacred objects, including what were probably statues of Yahweh himself. In Judah, the fall of Jerusalem marked a decisive rupture in traditional religious practice from which the body of God would never really recover. By the time the Jerusalem temple had been rebuilt in the early 5th century BCE, the city was under the religious control of powerful families newly returned from Babylonia, whose own experience had taught them that Yahweh had no need for a cult statue. To them, he was a deity transcending the bounds of temple and homeland, a hidden but powerful presence among his displaced people. Accordingly, some worshippers would come to see material images of the deity as religiously dangerous. In ritual terms, they were evidently vulnerable to displacement, disabling, or destruction, but in broader theological terms, they constrained an increasingly transcendent deity in ways some now found worryingly immobilizing.
Now, back in Jerusalem, this god was starting to be known as an unseen presence. It was during this period that images of Yahweh or other gods were being added to the 10 Commandments, and the Torah itself would replace cult statues. God's body didn't completely disappear yet. He would die a slow death, which placed him into a heavenly, otherworldly casket away from view. He started to become more and more transcendent, with only seers who visit this far, far away place could come back with revelations. The real death blow in this whole matter was the philosophical ideas about God that truly ended his physical body, even if the death was slow.
And yet the distance between God and humanity is light years from the image of God in the Bible. The Christian construct of God as a transcendent, invisible, and incorporeal being is a distorted refraction, not a reflection, of the biblical image of God. The real God of the Bible was an ancient Levantine deity whose footsteps shook the earth, whose voice thundered through the skies, and whose beauty and radiance dazzled his worshippers. This was a deity who crafted God-shaped humans from clay and breathed life into their nostrils. But this was also a God who wept and talked and slept and sulked, a God who felt and fought and loved and lost, a God who sometimes failed and sometimes triumphed. This was a God more like the best of us and the worst of us, a God made in our own image.
I sincerely hope you enjoyed this documentary showing you the real God of the Bible. My hopes are that you get a copy of Dr. Stavrakopoulou's book, God and Anatomy. This book shows the very interesting angle of God from the ancient world in a way I've never heard before. I hope if you've enjoyed this video and want to see more, you would be so kind as to show us support for the hard work we are doing on MythVision. You can help by joining our Patreon, YouTube membership programs, or one-time donation with links in the description. You can even do super thanks in the comment section of the video as well. I just hope more people will help us to keep bringing the insights and knowledge of great academic works such as hers to the public. I hope you will kindly like this video and tell me all the details that really impressed you in the video. Let's give Francesca some praises in the comment section and leave her a positive review on Amazon, friends. To all my corporeal friends with breath in their lungs, if your memory slips from time to time, let me help remind you who we are. We are MythVision.